He didn't even wait for Silas to tie his horse. Roderick Vale stepped out of the land office in Briar Junction like a man who already owned the street, his coat pressed clean, his boots without a single speck of mud, and a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket that he kept touching the way a man touches something he knows will hurt someone else. He looked at Silas Harrow the way you look at a stray dog you've already decided to run off. "Heard your bride didn't come," Vale said. Not a question. His mouth curled at one corner. That's a shame. Truly. He wasn't sorry. Not even close. And every person standing within earshot on that dirt street in the fall of 1887 knew it. Silas said nothing. He stood holding a telegram in his hand, still warm from the operator's desk, and his 4-year-old daughter Maisie pressed her face into the back of his leg because she didn't understand what was happening, only that her father had gone very still. That stillness. That was the thing that would haunt this story. Because Silas Harrow was the kind of man who went still when the world hit him. He didn't shout. He didn't break. He just absorbed it every blow, every loss, every winter, and kept standing. But there are only so many times a man can absorb the blow before something underneath starts to crack. And Roderick Vale knew exactly where the crack was. Before we go any further, if this kind of story reaches something deep in you, please take a second right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because the people who find these stories, they always find them for a reason. Don't miss what comes next. The telegram had arrived 2 days before Silas rode into town, but the postmaster held it at the office rather than send it out to the homestead. That was how things worked in Briar Junction. Letters came when someone came for them. Life moved at the pace of distance, so Silas didn't know yet. He rode those 6 miles from Raven Creek with Maisie, bundled in his coat against the October cold, her small fingers wrapped around his belt, her chin resting on his shoulder. She had been asking about the woman coming to stay with them since the end of summer. She asked Intaway children, ask things they're not entirely sure are real, yet carefully, checking her father's face each time to see if it was still safe to hope. Will she like me? Maisie had asked the night before, standing in the kitchen, while Silas tried to make something edible out of salt pork and dried corn. Don't see why she wouldn't, Silas said. Will she sleep in the house? That's the plan. What if she smells funny? Maisie. I'm just asking. He almost smiled. Almost. That was as close as Silas Harrow got to smiling those days, that small almost, that flicker at the corner of his mouth before something pulled it back down. He'd placed the notice 6 weeks prior, after the 3rd time Maisie woke up at midnight, calling for her mother, and Silas sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, not knowing what to say. His wife Clara had been gone 2 years. 2 years was long enough that the sharp grief had dulled to something heavier, a permanent ache that didn't announce itself, just sat in the chest like a stone you learned to carry. He thought he could manage it. The land, the child, the loneliness. He thought management was the same thing as living. It wasn't. The notice he posted wasn't romantic. He'd made sure of that. He wasn't looking for a wife, he told himself. He wasn't ready for that. He was looking for someone capable, someone who could keep a household from falling apart while he kept the land from doing the same. He'd written the notice 3 times and thrown away the first 2 because they sounded desperate. The 3rd version was so blunt that the man at the general store in Briar Junction read it twice and said, "You sure you don't want to soften this up a little?" "No," Silas said. Women don't usually respond well to a list of chores in the first paragraph. Then they're not the right woman for this situation. He wasn't wrong. Most of the responses he received were polite declines. A few were from women who'd clearly misread the notice and expected something warmer. One was from a woman in St. Louis who sent him a photograph and a letter describing herself as accustomed to comfort, which told him everything he needed to know. And then there was the one response that surprised him. Her name was Catherine Voss. She wrote in a plain, direct hand, no flourishes, no romantic language, no photograph. She described herself as practical, hardworking, accustomed to frontier conditions. She had family in Kansas. She understood the terms. She asked only 3 questions. What are the sleeping arrangements? Is the child in good health? How far is it from the nearest town? He wrote back answering all 3. She wrote again. He wrote again. By September, they had exchanged 4 letters, and something in the correspondence had shifted in a way Silas didn't examine too closely. She was smart, funny in a dry, quiet way. She wrote about her brother's farm in Nebraska like someone who understood exactly how hard that life was and had chosen it anyway. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was just sense. He rode to Briar Junction that October morning, believing Catherine Voss was on a train somewhere in the middle of the country, coming toward Raven Creek the way you ride toward something you've already decided on. The postmaster gave him the telegram without meeting his eyes. Silas read it standing at the counter, with Maisie tugging the edge of his coat, asking if there was candy at the general store. Telegram was short. It didn't need to be long. Deeply sorry. Have accepted another offer of marriage. Wish you well. Do not write again. Silas stood there for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably less than a minute. He folded the telegram. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked down at Maisie. Can we get candy? She asked. Sure, he said. He bought her a piece of horehound candy from the jar on the counter. She held it in both hands like something precious. He walked out onto the street with her, and that's when Roderick Vale was there, already watching, coat pressed, mouth curved, touching that paper in his pocket, like a man who'd been waiting. Heard your bride didn't come, Vale said. That's a shame, truly. The people on the street didn't say anything. They moved slightly, the way people do when they sense something is about to turn. But nobody stepped forward. That was the thing about Roderick Vale. He had a way of making people watch without acting. He was wealthy enough that disagreeing with him had consequences, and people in small towns understood consequences in ways city people never quite did. Silas looked at him. Just looked. The telegram was still folded in his pocket. Have a good day, Vale, he said. He put Maisie on the horse. He climbed up behind her, and he rode out of Briar Junction without looking back. But Vale watched him go, and the way he watched, slow, satisfied, patient, was the way a man watches something he intends to take his time destroying. Raven Creek Homestead sat on 160 acres of Kansas plain that Silas had claimed under the Homestead Act 6 years prior. He'd come out from Ohio with Clara and almost nothing else, driven as much by the need to be somewhere new as by any real plan. The land had been brutal with them. At first, the first winter nearly finished them. The Saxon spring brought insects that took half the crop, and the 3rd year Clara got sick with something the doctor in Briar Junction couldn't name and couldn't fix. But the land was theirs. That was the thing that mattered. It was paid for in years of his life, in Clara's labor, in frostbitten fingers and lean winters, and every kind of hard work there is. He had built the stone chimney himself, mortaring each rock with hands that bled in the cold. He had sunk the well 30 feet with a hand auger and 2 neighbors who owed him work. He had fenced the acreage in 3 summers of back-breaking post-setting. He had built a root cellar, a livestock shelter, and repaired the original claim shack into something that could actually keep out a plains winter. He had earned this land in a way that couldn't be measured in money. Roderick Vale didn't care about any of that. Vale had arrived in the county 3 years ago with Eastern capital and a lawyer on retainer and a talent for identifying homesteaders who were vulnerable. The pattern was always the same. Find a family struggling, find a technical problem with their claim or their improvements, file a competing claim or a dispute with the land office, and then wait. He was patient. He had money. He could wait. Silas found out about the claim against his acreage on a Tuesday in October, 4 days after he'd ridden back from Briar Junction with a piece of horehound candy for his daughter and a telegram in his pocket he hadn't read twice. The notice came from the land office in the county seat. Vale had filed a formal challenge, arguing that the eastern quarter of Silas's acreage, 40 acres, that contained his best grazing land and his well, was improperly claimed due to insufficient continuous improvement. The language was technical and careful, and written by someone who knew exactly how to make legal trouble sound reasonable. Silas read the notice at the kitchen table after Maisie was asleep. He read it 3 times. Then he sat in the dark for a while, with his hands flat on the table. He was 34 years old. He had a 4-year-old daughter who still sometimes cried for her mother at night. His food stores were going to be tight through February. He hadn't slept a full night since March, and the woman who was supposed to come and help him manage all of this had chosen another man. He thought about writing to his brother in Ohio. He thought about it for about 30 seconds, Before he rejected the idea completely. He had never asked his family for help, and he wasn't going to start now. That was pride, and he knew it was pride, and he didn't care. He went to bed. He lay in the dark listening to the wind work at the corners of the house. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Maisie's voice came from the other room, small and confused, calling a name that wasn't his. He got up. He went to her. He sat on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep, with her hand curled around two of his fingers. He sat there in the dark for a long time after that, listening to her breathe. In the morning, he rewrote the notice. The new notice was not like the first one. The first one had been careful, almost professional, trying to sound like a business arrangement, because that's how Silas had been thinking of it. The new one was different. He didn't set out to write it differently. It just came out that way. He wrote that he was a widower with a young child and a working homestead. He wrote that the homestead needed capable hands and a steady presence, and that in return he could offer fair wages, room and board, and a situation that was honest if not comfortable. He wrote that he was not looking for a wife. He wrote that clearly. He wrote that he was looking for someone who understood what real work was and wasn't afraid of what a Kansas winter looked like from the inside. He almost stopped there. Then he added one more line. The child's name is Maisie. She is 4 years old. She is the reason I am writing this. He posted it in Briar Junction on a Wednesday. He told himself he wasn't expecting much. 11 days later, a woman arrived at his gate. He was splitting wood in the yard when he heard the wagon. He didn't stop right away. He finished the split, set the halves aside, and turned around. The wagon belonged to a man from town who ran occasional freight. In the back was a travel bag, a bundle wrapped in canvas that turned out to be household items, a cast iron pot, some linens, a small tin of sewing supplies, and one other thing. A cedar cradle. It was old, beautifully made, the kind of joinery you didn't see from a kit, the kind done by someone who knew what they were doing and took their time. Most of its windows were dark. The wood had gone the color of dark honey, and it was carved along the headboard with a pattern of leaves that might have been oak or might have been something the maker had imagined. Silas looked at the cradle. Then he looked at the woman climbing down from the wagon. She was not what he'd pictured. He realized standing there in the yard that he had been picturing something, despite telling himself he wasn't, and that thing was not this. She was somewhere in her late 20s, medium height, with a face that wasn't pretty, in the way illustrated papers made pretty look. It was something quieter than that. Composed. Like someone who had made a decision a long time ago not to waste energy performing emotions for other people. She wore a gray dress and a coat that had been good quality once. She carried her bag herself without waiting for anyone to offer. I'm Lenora Wren, she said. I'm answering the notice. Silas Harrow looked at her. Behind him, the back door of the house opened and Maisie appeared in the doorway, still in her sleep clothes because she'd been having a nap, her hair going every direction, her cornhusk doll held against her chest. She stared at Lenora Wren with the absolute unguarded attention that only small children and very old dogs can manage. Is that the lady? Maisie asked. Silas cleared his throat. Her name's Miss Wren. Does she smell funny? There was a pause. Lenora looked at the child. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, like a door opening just slightly before someone remembers to be careful. Not that I know of, Lenora said. Maisie considered this with great seriousness. Then she came down the steps across the yard in her sock feet and stood in front of Lenora and looked up at her. I have a doll, she said. Her name is Nell. That's a good name for a doll. She doesn't have a cradle. Lenora was quiet for a second. Just a second. Maybe she'll have one soon, she said. Silas showed Lenora the house. It didn't take long. It was 3 rooms, the main room that served as kitchen and sitting space, a sleeping room for him, a sleeping alcove off the kitchen where he'd put a small bed for Maisie when she got old enough to stop sharing his room. There was a loft above that was technically a storage space, but could hold a cot if you didn't mind the slant of the roof. Loft's the best I can offer, he said. It's private. Stays reasonably warm once the stove's going. I'll put up a curtain. Lenora looked up at the loft ladder. That's fine, she said. I'd normally ask if you have questions, but you probably do. So, how long have your stores been this thin? She said, blinked. She was looking at the shelf beside the kitchen door, the flour barrel, the salt pork, the dried corn. The way the spaces between things told a story she'd apparently read in about 4 seconds. They're adequate, Silas said. They're not, actually. Not unkind. Just matter of fact. Not for 3 people through to March. Not if February runs long, which it usually does out here. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at the shelf, cataloging something in her head. I grew up on a homestead, she said, Missouri, then Nebraska. I know what February looks like when you've miscounted. Silas said nothing. He hated that she was right. He hated that she could see it so fast. I'm not criticizing, Lenora said. She finally looked at him. I'm telling you so I know what we're working with. We. He noticed that word. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. All right, he said. I'll need to go through the root cellar. Fine. And I'd like to know what arrangements you've made for the claim dispute. He went very still. She met his eyes without flinching. I heard talk in town when the wagon came through. People talk. I'm not pretending I didn't hear it. That's my business, Silas said. I'm about to live in the house connected to that business, Lenora said. So I'd like to know the situation. The silence between them lasted a moment too long. He thought about telling her it was fine. He thought about saying something reassuring. That wasn't true. He didn't know why he didn't. Maybe because she'd already seen through the food stores in about 5 seconds and there didn't seem to be much point in pretending. It's not good, Silas said the claim. It's not good. Lenora nodded, like she'd expected that. Then we'll figure it out, she said. That was the first day. The cedar cradle went in the corner of the main room because there was nowhere else to put it, and because Maisie appeared beside it within 10 minutes and began asking questions about it with the persistence of someone who has identified exactly the thing they want. What's it for? Maisie asked. It's for keeping, Lenora said. She was unpacking her canvas bundle on the kitchen table, setting things out in an order that made sense to her. Keeping what? Things that matter. Maisie looked at the cradle. Then she looked at Nell, her cornhusk doll. Could Nell sleep in it? If you'd like her to. Maisie very carefully placed Nell in the center of the cradle. Then she stood back and looked at it with the expression of someone who has solved a problem they didn't know they had. Lenora watched this without turning around from the table, but she watched it. Silas could tell because her hands went still for a moment before she went back to what she was doing. He didn't ask about the cradle that first day. He could see it was not a simple object. He was not a man who pried. There were enough things in this house that weren't simple. But that night, after Maisie was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Lenora sat at the kitchen table, writing something in a small journal, a list. It looked like, though he didn't read it, and Silas, sitting across the room mending a harness strap, found himself thinking about the way she'd said, "We'll figure it out," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Not like she was being generous, like she meant it. He couldn't remember the last time someone had said that to him and meant it. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't that kind of man. But somewhere's underneath the silence, something in him that had been braced against the cold for 2 years shifted the smallest amount. Not much, just enough to notice. Outside, the wind came across the plains. The fire in the stove breathed in and out. Maisie slept. And 2 people who didn't know each other at all sat in the same room with a cedar cradle between them that belonged to grief, and slowly, without anyone deciding to, began the very first tentative, ordinary work of learning to share the same air. It wasn't a beginning anyone would have chosen, but beginnings rarely are. The morning after Lenora arrived, Silas woke before dawn the way he always did, not from an alarm, not from any particular sound, but from the habit of a man whose body had long since decided that sleeping past 4:30 was a luxury the land wouldn't allow. He lay there for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. It was different. Listening to the house with someone else in it. Not better or worse, just different. There was a weight to the silence that hadn't been there before. The particular quality of air in a space where another person is breathing somewhere, you can't see them. He got up. He built the fire in the stove. He put water on for coffee. He was standing at the window looking out at the gray pre-dawn when he heard the loft ladder creak, and then Lenora came down in the same dress she'd worn the day before. Her hair pinned back already, carrying a small canvas apron she'd apparently had in her bag. She looked at the stove, at the coffee pot, at him. "You made the fire," she said. "It's my house. I wasn't criticizing." She tied the apron on. "I was going to do it. I was already up." She looked at him for a second, like she was deciding whether to say something. Then she didn't say it and moved to the stove and checked the water temperature with the back of her hand the way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times. "Do you have cornmeal?" she asked. "In the barrel by the door. And the salt pork?" "Same shelf as yesterday." She went to work without another word. Silas stood by the window and watched her for a moment, not in any particular way, just with the mild disorientation of a man who had been the only adult in this kitchen for 2 years and was now not. She moved like someone who knew how to occupy a space without taking up more of it than necessary. Efficient but not rigid. She found where things were on the second try, not the first, and she didn't ask him each time. She figured it out. By the time Maisie appeared in the doorway of her alcove, blinking and dragging Nell by one arm, there were cornmeal cakes on the iron skillet, and salt pork cut thin, and the smell of coffee filling the room. Maisie stopped. She looked at the stove. She looked at Lenora. "You cook," Maisie said. "Most people do," Lenora said. "Papa burns things," Silas said. "He does," she said, with the complete conviction of someone who has eaten burned cornmeal enough times to consider it a defining characteristic of a person. She climbed into her chair at the table and set Nell in her lap. "He burned the beans last week, and he said a word he told me not to say." Lenora glanced at Silas, just briefly. The corner of her mouth did that thing again, that not-quite smile. "People say things when they burn beans," she said. "Do you?" "Occasionally." Maisie appeared to find this deeply satisfying. She sat up straighter. "What word?" "Not telling," Lenora said. Breakfast was the best thing Maisie had eaten in recent memory, which was not a high bar to clear, but she ate 3 cornmeal cakes and asked for a 4th, and Lenora gave it to her without making a production out of it. Silas ate in silence and didn't say that the coffee was the best he'd had since Clara died, because he wasn't going to say that, but it was. He went out to the livestock after breakfast. He had 6 head of cattle to tend to, a pair of draft horses, and a small flock of chickens that barely justified the corn he spent on them, but which Maisie was devoted to with a ferocity he'd given up arguing about. He worked through the morning, feeding, watering, checking the fence along the east pasture where 2 of the corner posts had soft from the fall, wet. When he came back to the house around midday, he almost didn't recognize it. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing was transformed or overhauled. But in the 2 hours he'd been outside, Lenora had apparently gone through the root cellar, reorganized the kitchen shelves, mended 2 of Maisie's dresses that had been sitting in a pile on the chair by the stove waiting for attention. For he didn't want to calculate how long, and was now sitting at the table with Maisie doing some kind of counting exercise with dried beans. Her voice patient, and even as Maisie moved the beans around and got distracted twice and knocked half of them on the floor. Silas stood in the doorway. "The root cellar needs more turnips," Lenora said without looking up from the beans. "And you're short on dried apple. If you have any credit at the general store in town, I'd like to make a list before prices go up at the end of the month." He came inside and hung his coat. "I have some credit." "How much?" he told her. She nodded, calculating something in her head. "It'll be enough if we're careful," she said. "We're always careful." "You're careful with the livestock and the fencing," she said. She still wasn't being unkind. It was just precise. The food stores needed a different kind of careful. He sat down across from her. Maisie was arranging the fallen beans on the floor. In a pattern she appeared to consider significant. "How do you know what the stores needed?" he asked. "You've been here one morning." "I counted what was in the cellar this morning," Lenora said, "and I looked at how things were arranged. You store things by where there's room, not by what you'll need first. When February comes, you'll be reaching past the things you need to get to the things you don't." He looked at her. She looked back. "My father did the same thing," she said. "Every winter we ended up eating the good cornmeal first and finding the turnips in March, underneath everything else going soft. Your father homesteaded? Missouri first. Then Nebraska when the Missouri claim didn't hold." She glanced at the beans on the table, then back at him. "We know what we know from what didn't work." He was quiet for a moment. There was something in that sentence he recognized. Something that fit into the shape of his own experience in a way he hadn't expected from a stranger. "All right," he said. "Make your list. I'll go to town Thursday." She nodded. She went back to the beans with Maisie. And Silas sat there for another moment longer than was strictly necessary before he got up and went back outside. He told himself he was just resting his feet. He wasn't. The second week was harder than the first. Not because anything went dramatically wrong, but because the ordinary friction of two adults sharing a space they hadn't built together started to show at the edges. Silas had particular ways of doing things, particular rhythms he'd fallen into over 2 years of managing alone, and Lenora had her own sense of how things ought to work, and the two didn't always line up cleanly. She rearranged the woodpile beside the back door. She moved it 3 feet to the left so the door could swing open without catching on the top logs. It made practical sense. He knew it made practical sense. He still stood staring at it for a full minute. The first morning he noticed it, something prickling at him that he couldn't quite name. She said nothing about it. She clearly expected that he wouldn't. He didn't. She had a habit of going quiet when she was thinking, not the vacant quiet of someone spacing out, but the concentrated quiet of someone working a problem in their head, and if you spoke to her in the middle of it, she'd look up with her eyes slightly focused at a distance and take a second to come back. He found this unsettling in a way he couldn't articulate, and slightly irritating in a way he could but chose not to. He had a habit of leaving the morning's harness work on the bench inside the door, because he meant to get back to it in the afternoon and forgot half the time. She moved it twice without saying anything. The third time she moved it, he found it on his chair. Having to step over it, she said. When he came in and found it there, "I know where I left it," he said. "You left it where I walk about 40 times a day." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "I'll move it to the barn," he said. "Thank you," she said. Not a victory. Not a defeat. Just a negotiation conducted in about 6 sentences by 2 people who were both too tired for dramatics. But Maisie was thriving. That was the thing Silas couldn't deny and didn't try to. Whatever the adjustments were between him and Lenora, whatever the friction of 2 people learning each other's edges, the effect on Maisie was visible and immediate and real. She was eating better more and more regularly. She was sleeping through more nights. She laughed more. She'd been a quiet child since Clara died. The kind of quiet that sits in a kid like an old bruise you can't see, but know is there. And in the 2 weeks since Lenora arrived, some of that old bruise quiet had started to lift around the edges. She followed Lenora everywhere. Not in an intrusive way, Maisie had good instincts about space. Had learned that particular skill from growing up around a man who needed his. But she orbited Lenora the way planets orbit something that generates warmth, at a careful and hopeful distance, always angling slightly closer. Lenora let her. More than let her, she incorporated her. When she baked, Maisie stood on a stool beside her and was given something to do, even if it was just pressing patterns into the top of a cornbread with her thumb. When she mended clothes, Maisie sat across from her with a scrap of fabric and a needle and made something she called sewing that was more accurately described as stabbing cloth in a way that expressed enthusiasm. Lenora praised the effort and corrected the grip and praised the effort again. She never talked down to Maisie. That was the thing Silas noticed most. She spoke to her like a person who happened to be small and inexperienced, not like a toy or a project. When Maisie asked a question Lenora couldn't or didn't want to answer, she said so directly instead of deflecting, "I don't know. Let's find out," or "That's not something I'm going to explain right now. But I will someday," and Maisie, to Silas's constant amazement, accepted this and moved on. He asked of its windows about it one evening when Maisie had gone to bed, and they were both at the table, him working accounts, her hemming one of Maisie's dresses. "You're good with her," he said. Lenora kept hemming. "She's a good kid, she is. But it's more than that. You know how to talk to her." She was quiet for a moment. Her needle moved in and out. "I spent some time with a child before," she said. "I know what it's like when people don't take them seriously." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He looked back at his accounts. There was a lot that Lenora didn't say more about. He noticed this without pressing on it. He wasn't a pressing kind of man. He'd learned from life, from Clara, from years of his own silence, that people say things when they're ready to say them, and pushing before then mostly just breaks something that hadn't finished forming yet. The cedar cradle sat in the corner of the main room, and Maisie had made it Nell's permanent home. She moved the doll in and out of it with ceremony, sometimes tucking her in with a scrap of cloth, sometimes propping her up against the curved headboard to see what was happening. The cradle had shifted in the 3 weeks since Lenora arrived. From being an object of quiet weight to being something that was simply part of the room, a fixture, like the stove or the table, present and unremarkable. Silas noticed this. He also noticed that Lenora watched the cradle from across the room with an expression he didn't have a name for. Not sad exactly. Something more complex than that. Like looking at a place where something happened that you've had to decide not to let keep happening to you. He'd had that look himself in the first year after Clara. He recognized it. He didn't say anything, but he thought about it. It was the fourth Thursday after Lenora arrived when things changed. She had gone into town with him that morning. The first time she'd ridden into Briar Junction since she'd arrived. And he noticed the way she took the town in without being obvious about it, the way someone does who is quietly mapping a place they intend to know. She went to the general store with her list, while he went to see about a piece of equipment at the feed merchant. He was on his way back across the street when he saw Vale. Vale was coming out of the land office. He had two other men with him, his ranch hands, both of them considerably larger than their employer in the way that men who are paid to be large generally are. Vale saw Silas at the same moment. He stopped. He looked past Silas to where Lenora was coming out of the general store with her parcels. Something passed across Vale's face that Silas didn't like. "Found yourself some company," Vale said. "Household help," Silas said, flat, giving him nothing. "Household help." Vale repeated it slowly, like he was tasting something. "How domestic. Does she know about the land situation? That you might not have much of a household to help with come December?" One of the men behind Vale made a sound that might have been a laugh. Silas looked at Vale. He had the particular feeling he always got around this man, a cold, settled anger. Not the hot kind, not the kind that makes you want to shout. Cold kind, the kind that stays. "We'll see what December looks like," Silas said. He glanced once more at Lenora, who was now standing at the edge of the street a few yards away, watching with the same composed expression she brought to everything. "We certainly will," he walked on. His men followed. Silas didn't move for a second. He was aware of his own breathing and the way his hands had closed at his sides without him deciding to do that. Lenora came up beside him. "That's him," she said. "Not a question. That's him." She watched Vale's back disappear around the corner of the feed merchant's building. Her expression hadn't changed much, but her eyes were doing that focused distance thing. "He's going to use the bride thing," she said. Silas looked at her. "What?" "The fact that she didn't come. The fact that you're out there alone with a child. That's his argument, isn't it? That you can't sustain a household on your own? That the homestead will fail because you can't manage it solo with a kid? Quiet. That's what he's building toward," Lenora said. "I heard talk at the store. People repeat things they hear in offices if you buy enough flour from them." "It's not any of your concern," Silas said. She turned and looked at him directly. Her parcels were under one arm. The wind was pulling at the loose hairs at the side of her face. "I live in your house," she said. "I cook for your daughter. I've reorganized your root cellar and mended half her wardrobe, and I can see how this is going to go if something isn't done about it." She stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. "I'm telling you I'm not unaware of the situation. That's all I'm telling you." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I have a meeting with an attorney next week," he said. "Gideon Pell, over in the county seat. He knows land law." Lenora nodded once. "I'd like to walk the property before you go," she said. "All of it. The full boundary." He blinked. "Why?" "Because I want to know what we're defending," she said. She turned and walked back toward where the wagon was hitched. Silas stood there another second, looking at the corner around which Roderick Vale had disappeared, feeling the cold anger still sitting in his chest, and alongside it now, something new and complicated, not quite relief, because relief was premature, but something that might grow into it, if things went a certain way. He followed her to the wagon. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't done anything yet that required it. But the word was in him somewhere, waiting. Property walk happened on a Sunday, when the weather held and the ground was still hard enough to cross comfortably. Lenora wore her heaviest coat and a pair of boots that had seen serious work. She carried the small journal she'd had since the first night, and a stick of graphite wrapped in cloth. Silas showed her the east boundary first, because that was the contested acreage, the 40 acres Vale had targeted with his claim. He showed her the fence line, the corner posts, the way the grazing land opened up toward the creek in the southeast corner. He showed her where the well sat and how he dug it and when. He pointed out the rock cairns that marked his original claim stakes. She wrote things down in the journal without asking him to slow down or repeat himself. Then she surprised him. She asked to see everything else. Not just the contested 40, all of it, the stone chimney, how it was laid when it was built, the root cellar, the beams, the drainage, the livestock shelter, the fencing, the repaired structures, every improvement, every piece of work, everything he'd done to this land that demonstrated continuous habitation and active stewardship. She walked it all. The cold was significant. By the time they'd covered the back half of the property she was moving, with the particular rigid efficiency of someone who is cold enough to notice it, but not going to say so. Silas handed her his extra coat from the saddle roll without asking. She looked at it for a second, then put it on over her own without comment. She asked questions he hadn't expected, not questions about the legal situation, but questions about the work. How deep were the well logs? What year was the chimney mortared? Who witnessed the fence setting? Had he kept any records of the livestock count? I have account books, he said, going back 5 years. She stopped walking. She turned to look at him, with dates and livestock numbers and crop yields. I kept them for tax purposes. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, something slightly warmer than her usual composure. Not quite surprise, but close to it. Those records are evidence, she said. That's 5 years of documented continuous improvement. Gideon Pell needs to know about those. I hadn't thought. Vale's argument is that the homestead is failing, Lenora said. 5 years of increasing livestock numbers and crop yields tells its different sorcery. She turned and kept walking, writing something in the journal. And so does this. She gestured with the graphite stick at the stone chimney visible above the roofline of the house. You didn't pay someone to lay that, she said. No. Who witnessed it, he thought. Caleb heard, from the next claim east, his wife, and a man named Blevins, who came through doing day work that summer. Blevins is gone, but the herds are still there. She wrote that down. They walked back to the house in the early afternoon, with the wind picking up from the northwest. Maisie was in the house with a neighbor woman named Agnes Pruitt, who'd come to sit with her while they walked the land. And as they came through the back door, they could hear Maisie explaining something at length to Agnes in the serious instructional tone she used when she had information she considered essential to share. Lenora pulled off the extra coat and handed it back to him. Her cheeks were red from the cold. She went to the stove and held her hands out toward it. I need to organize what I wrote, she said. Tonight. I want to put it in order, every improvement, with a date and a witness, cross-referenced to your account books. He hung up the coats. He looked at her at the stove. Why? He said. She turned around. Because when Gideon Pell walks into that land office hearing, Lenora said, he needs to walk in with more than your word. He needs to walk in with a record that Roderick Vale's lawyer is going to have to argue against line by line. Silas stood there in the kitchen doorway. He'd spent the weeks since the land notice arrived feeling the particular dread of a man who sees something coming that he can't stop, who knows the shape of the disaster, but can't find the lever to change its direction. He'd talked to Pell, scheduled the meeting, gone through the motions of preparing. But underneath all of it had been the cold certainty that Vale had money and lawyers and patience, and Silas had none of those things in quantities that matched. He had the land. He had the work. He had 5 years of hard evidence. It had just taken someone else to see how to use it. All right, he said. She turned back to the stove. In the other room, Maisie was still explaining something to Agnes Pruitt. It sounded like it was about chickens. Agnes was making the sounds of someone who has been told more about chickens than they strictly required. Silas almost smiled. Almost, he went to get the account books. Lenora worked on the inventory that evening, and for 2 evenings after. She sat at the kitchen table after Maisie was in bed with the journal, and his account books open side by side, cross-checking dates, building a document that was meticulous in the way that only someone who grew up watching things fail from poor documentation could be meticulous. Most of its windows were dark. She asked him questions when she hit something she couldn't answer from the records alone, and he answered them from where he sat across the room, and gradually the inventory grew into something that had weight and substance and the particular authority of careful truth. He watched her work without watching her work. if that makes any sense. He was not a man who stared, but he was aware of her the way her hand moved across the page, the slight frown that meant she was verifying something against two sources before writing it down, the way she occasionally stopped, the way she and looked at the ceiling for a moment before continuing, like she was organizing something in her head before committing it to paper. It occurred to him, sitting there on the third night of this, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in this room in the evening and not felt alone in it. Not because he was talking to her. They were barely talking. But there was a quality to the shared silence, a texture to it that was different from the silence of a man sitting alone. It was inhabited. The room felt inhabited in a way it hadn't since Clara. He didn't let himself think about that too directly. He had enough to manage without going down that particular road. But he was aware of it. Underneath everything else, a low awareness that settled without asking permission. Maisie was the one who finally broke open what none of them had been saying. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the land hearing. Maisie was in the corner of the main room with Nell in the cradle, tucking the doll in with great ceremony. When she looked up at Lenora, with the sudden attention shift that children do when a thought arrives fully formed and demands immediate exit. "Bad man going to take our house?" she asked. The room went quiet. Lenora was at the table writing. Her hands stopped. She looked at Maisie. Silas, who had been standing by the back window, went still in the particular way he did when something hit him before he was ready. He'd been careful. He hadn't discussed the land dispute in front of Maisie. He hadn't said Vale's name at the table. But children hear more than you realize. They absorb it from the texture of adult worry, from the slight change in how a house feels when the people in it are afraid. Maisie was looking at Lenora. Not at him. At Lenora. Lenora set down her graphite stick. She looked at Maisie directly. "What makes you think that?" she asked. Agnes Pruitt told Mrs. "Heard that a bad man wants Papa's farm," Maisie said, with the faithful specificity of a child, repeating something they were not meant to have heard. She said he was going to win because Papa is alone. The silence was several different weights at once. Lenora held Maisie's eyes. "Agnes Pruitt doesn't know what I know," Lenora said. Maisie blinked. "What do you know?" "I know your father has worked this land for 6 years. Her voice was even. Not falsely cheerful, not trying to coat anything with something sweet. Just steady. I know he built that chimney stone by stone and dug that well with his own hands. I know he's kept records of every head of cattle and every crop, and I've been writing all of it down so that nobody can pretend it isn't true. Most of its windows were dark. Maisie was listening with her whole body, the way children do when they're deciding whether to believe something. And Lenora said, "Your papa is not alone." The sentence landed in the room with a weight that was clearly meant for more than one listener. Silas didn't move. He was looking at the window, or looking at the reflection in the window. He couldn't have said which. Maisie looked at the cradle. She straightened Nell's scrap cloth blanket. "Okay," she said, with the profound simplicity of a 4-year-old who has received the answer they needed and is now ready to return to more important matters. She picked up Nell and began retucking her. Lenora picked up the graphite stick and went back to writing. Silas stood at the window for another moment. Something had just been in this room that wasn't in any of the account books, and wasn't in the inventory, and wasn't in the legal argument. Gideon Pell was building in the county seat. Your papa is not alone. He didn't know what to do with that. He was a man built from the practice of managing things alone, and when something arrived that didn't fit that structure, he tended to not examine it too closely until it was no longer avoidable. But he heard it. Underneath the practical armor of accounts and legal hearings as in winter stores, he heard it, and he thought she had intended him to. He went back to his work without saying anything. Lenora kept writing without looking up. Maisie sang something to Nell in the soft, half-tuneless way of children, who are fully absorbed in their own world. Outside, the October wind ran over the plains and pressed against the walls of the house, looking for gaps. The house held, the way it had always held, when the people inside it decided to hold it together. In 2 weeks, Silas would ride to the county seat to meet with Gideon Pell. He would lay the account books on the attorney's desk and watch Pell's eyebrows rise as he turned the pages. He would describe the inventory Lenora had compiled and watch Pell sit back in his chair and say something that would change how Silas understood what was possible. But that was in 2 weeks. Tonight, The fire in the stove breathed steadily. The cedar cradle sat in its corner with Nell tucked inside. Maisie's voice went soft and then went quiet as she drifted somewhere between waking and sleep in the corner. And Lenora Wren wrote down every stone and post and beam and worked acre of Raven Creek homestead, line by line, in her careful hand, building something out of ordinary truth that Roderick Vale, with all his money and his patience and the paper folded in his breast pocket, had not counted on. He had expected to wait for Silas Harrow to fail. He had not expected someone to show up and refuse to let him. Gideon Pell's office in the county seat smelled like old paper and wood smoke, and something underneath both of those are things that might have been the particular anxiety of people who had sat in the chairs across from his desk and heard bad news. The office was small 2 windows, one facing the street and one facing an alley, and every flat surface was covered with documents, stacked in a way that looked chaotic, but probably wasn't. Pell himself was a man in his middle 50s, thin in the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been serious. For so long it had forgotten what the other option looked like. He read through the inventory for a long time, without saying anything. Silas sat across from him and waited. He was good at waiting. He'd had a lot of practice. The account books were open on the desk beside the inventory, and Pell kept moving his eyes between the two, running a finger along a line in one, and then finding the corresponding entry in the other. The clock on the wall behind him marked the minutes in a way that felt louder than it probably was. Finally, Pell set the inventory down and took his glasses off and looked at Silas. "Who prepared this?" he asked. "The woman I hired on," Silas said. "Lenora Wren. She walked the property and cross-referenced it against the account books." Pell looked at the inventory again. "This is thorough," he said. "I mean genuinely thorough. Every improvement is dated and witnessed and substantiated by the records." He tapped the top page. "This isn't just helpful, this is the kind of document that changes the shape of an argument." "She's detail-minded," Silas said, which was the most he felt he could offer without sounding like he was making a speech about someone. Pell leaned back in his chair. He picked up a separate document, Vale's filing, and held the two side by side without reading them, just feeling their weight. "Here is the problem," Pell said, "and I want you to understand it clearly, because it is a problem regardless of how good this inventory is." Silas nodded. "Vale's legal argument has 2 components," Pell said. "The first is the technical improvement claim, which he set down the inventory largely dismantles. 5 years of documented record, independent witnesses to major structures, continuous occupation. That part of his argument is going to be difficult for his attorney to press against this kind of evidence." "And the second?" Silas asked. Pell set the documents on the desk. He looked at Silas steadily. "The second is you," he said, "specifically your situation. Vale has been talking to people in the county seat, to people at the land office, about the instability of a widower homesteader raising a small child without adequate support. He's been building a picture, a man on the edge of failure, a child who will need to be sent elsewhere, a household that is functionally unsustainable." Pell laced his fingers together on the desk. "His argument will be that even if the improvements are legitimate, the ongoing capacity to maintain the claim is questionable given the circumstances of the household." The room was quiet. "The bride who didn't come," Silas said. "Flat. He knows about that. Of course he does." He looked at the window. Briar Junction was 20 miles away, but somehow it felt like the same room. Small county. "The timing of the claim filing was not accidental," Pell said. "He filed it 2 weeks after you received that telegram. That's deliberate. He wanted the claim on record while your situation was at its most visibly precarious." Silas let out a slow breath through his nose. He'd known this, somewhere underneath, but hearing it stated plainly made it sit differently in his chest. "So the inventory helps but doesn't fix it," Silas said. "The inventory is essential," Pell said, "but it addresses the first argument, not the second. The second argument is about the future of the households, not the past. And the hearing is in December 6 weeks from now." Silas looked at the desk. At the inventory, Lenora had spent 3 evenings building with her careful hand and her graphite sticks next while Matesai slept, and the fire burned, and the wind pressed against the walls of the house. "What would fix the second argument?" he asked, though he had an idea. He wanted to hear it said by someone whose job it was to know these things. Pell was quiet for a moment. He looked at Silas with the expression of a man about to say something he has decided to say as directly as possible. Permanent household, Pell said. Not a hired hand and a widower. A legally constituted family unit with 2 adults committed to maintaining the claim. That would change Vale's argument from a reasonable concern about sustainability to a matter of speculation about things that haven't happened and aren't likely to. The clock on the wall counted seconds. You're talking about marriage, Silas said. I'm talking about what changes the legal picture, Pell said. What you do with that is your business entirely. Silas picked up his hat from his knee and looked at it. It was an old hat. Clara had given it to him in their 2nd year when the first one wore out. He'd never replaced it. He stood up. I'll think on it, he said. Pell stood as well. Think quickly, he said. We have 6 weeks. The ride back from the county seat took the better part of the day. Silas didn't push the horse. He let the animal set its own pace, and he sat with his thoughts and the wide Kansas plain and the sky that was doing what October skies did out here, enormous and gray-white, the kind of sky that looked like it was holding its breath. He went over if its windows were dark. He went over the conversation with Pell the way he went over everything methodically, looking at it from each angle, turning it until he understood its shape. He was not a man who made fast decisions. He was not a man who made any decision without looking at it long enough to see what it was really made of. What he kept coming back to was not the legal argument, not Vale's strategy or Pell's assessment of the evidence or the timeline to December. He kept coming back to what Lenora had said to Maisie. Your papa is not alone. She had said it as a statement of fact, not as a declaration, not as a pledge, as a simple correction of available information. The way she said everything, like the truth was a practical tool, and she was just reaching for the right one. But she had meant it. He was certain of that. He was also certain that what Pell was suggesting, what the legal situation was pointing toward with the blunt force of a thing that doesn't care about your feelings, was something that had to be approached with complete honesty. There could be no pretending, no false framing, no dressing something up as something it wasn't. He was not going to ask a woman to marry him because it was convenient. He was not going to ask her without being honest about every part of what he was asking. Problem, he realized, as the house came into view, across the plain with its stone chimney and the thin line of smoke rising from the kitchen stove, was that being honest about what he was asking required. Being honest about things he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. That was going to take the rest of the ride. It took longer than that. He came in just before supper. Lenora was at the stove. Maisie was under the kitchen table, which was, apparently a location she had decided, was excellent for the game she was playing. The nature of which was unclear. She stuck her head out when she heard him come in and said Papa with the particular announcement quality of a child who is very involved in something and wanted you to know they'd registered your presence before returning to it. Food in 20 minutes, Lenora said, without turning from the stove. All right, Silas said. He hung his coat. He sat at the table. Maisie went back under it. From underneath the table came the sounds of Nell's ongoing imaginary life, which apparently involved a great deal of travel. Lenora put a bowl of something in front of him. When the food was ready, a thick stew, beans and pork, and the dried apple she'd insisted on getting from the general store, which gave it a sweetness that shouldn't have worked but did. She lifted Maisie out from under the table with the ease of someone who had made this a routine, sat her in her chair, put a smaller bowl in front of her. They ate. The stew was good. He didn't say so. He'd been meaning to say more, to name the meals as good, to acknowledge what she'd been doing and kept not doing it, for reasons he couldn't have fully explained. Some combination of the habit of silence, and the awareness that saying it opened something he wasn't sure he was ready to have opened. How was Pell? Lenora asked. He looked up from the bowl. He said the inventory is strong, Silas said. He said it changes the shape of the first argument significantly. She heard the word first, and her eyes didn't change, but something behind them did. There's a second argument, she said. There is. Maisie was eating with the concentration of someone who has been informed that finishing dinner relates in some way to getting a piece of horehound candy, which Silas had brought back from the county seat and made the strategic error of showing her before supper. Vale's been talking to people at the land office, Silas said, building a picture of an unstable household, a man who can't manage alone. He looked at his bowl. He filed the claim 2 weeks after the telegram came. He timed it. Lenora was quiet. She was thinking. He wanted to file while you looked most isolated, she said. Yes. So the inventory addresses the first piece, she said, but the second piece is about what the household looks like going into the hearing. That's what Pell said. And what does Pell think changes that picture? Silas looked at her directly. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind moved across the plain in the particular way it did in October, not the cutting cold of December yet, but the warning of it. He said a permanent household, Silas said, legally constituted. 2 adults committed to the claim. The sentence sat between them. Maisie was still eating, apparently not processing the adult conversation in any meaningful way, which was not always a safe assumption with Maisie, but appeared to be the case right now. Lenora looked at her bowl for a moment. He said marriage, she said. He was careful not to say that. But yes, that's what he meant. Another silence. Lenora set her spoon down. Not with frustration, she didn't make gestures out of frustration, as far as he'd seen. Just setting it down. I see, she said. I'm not asking you anything right now, Silas said. I wanted you to know what the situation is. You've been in it with me this far. You deserve to know the whole shape of it. She looked up at him. Most of its windows were dark. There was something in her expression that he couldn't fully read something she was deciding about, working through, in the way she worked through things, in the quiet, concentrated space of her own head. Finish your supper, she said. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a pause, a request for the kind of space that ideas need before they can be examined properly. He recognized it because he needed the same kind of space. He went back to his stew. Maisie finished hers and looked up, with the expression of someone completing a transaction. I finished, she announced. I can see that, Lenora said. Can I have the candy now? Ask your father. Maisie turned to Silas with the focused intention of someone making a business proposition. Can I have the candy now? She said. Half, Silas said. This was accepted as reasonable. Silas broke the piece of horehound candy he'd brought from the county seat and gave her half, and she went back under the table, apparently considering it the superior location for candy consumption. The sounds from under the table shifted to include contented chewing. Lenora picked up her spoon and finished her supper. They didn't speak for a while. The fire did its work. The wind did its work. Maisie did hers. That night, after Maisie was in bed, Lenora did not go up to the loft. She sat at the table and looked at the cedar cradle in the corner. Silas was at the other end of the table. He was not pretending to do accounts. He was just sitting. After a long time, Lenora said, The cradle belonged to my sister. He waited. Her name was Pearl. Lenora's voice was the same even tone she always used, but there was something underneath it now that he hadn't heard before, not grief exactly, not anymore. Something that had been grief for a long time, and had changed into something else without being replaced. She was 4 years younger than me. She married a man from Nebraska, went west with him. She was going to have a child. She stopped for a moment. She didn't live through it, Lenora said. The baby didn't either. Her husband wrote to me 3 weeks after. He'd sold almost everything by then. He sent the cradle because he couldn't look at it. The fire breathed. I took it, Lenora said. I don't know exactly why. I think I felt like if I left it somewhere, if I didn't carry it, something of Pearl went with it. Something I wasn't ready to let go of. She looked at the cradle, at Nell tucked inside it under a scrap of cloth. I carried it on 3 different wagons, and 2 trains and into your house. She looked up at him. I didn't know it would end up a doll's bed, she said. And the not-quite smile came. The one he'd learned was real, because it wasn't complete. He looked at the cradle. He thought about the weight of carrying something like that across the frontier. Not the physical weight, the other kind. I'm sorry about Pearl, he said. It was simple. He didn't try to make it more than that. He'd learned that the simple, true thing was always better than the elaborate, compassionate thing that wasn't quite true. Lenora nodded. I came west because I needed to go somewhere that wasn't where I was, she said. I wasn't running from anything specific. I was just used up where I was. After Pearl, I needed somewhere real to put myself. She looked at the table. Your notice was the only one that sounded honest, she said. Most of them were trying to be something. Yours just said what it was. I wrote it in a bad mood, Silas said. She looked at him. I'd just thrown away the second version, he said. The one that tried to sound reasonable. What does it say? Something about offering a pleasant domestic situation and the opportunity for a hard-working woman to build a future. He paused. It sounded like I was selling furniture. The not-quite smile again. This time slightly more. The version you posted was better, she said. Grim, though. Honest, she said. Grim and honest aren't the same thing. He looked at her across the table. In the low firelight, with the wind outside and the house holding its warmth around them, he was aware of things he had not been letting himself be aware of for the past several weeks. Not because he was unaware of them, he was a perceptive man underneath all the quiet, but because he had understood, without articulating it to himself, that examining them too closely, too soon, would damage something that was still forming. Things that were still forming needed to be left alone for a little while. Like mortar setting. You couldn't test it before it had time. But now Pell's voice was in his head, and Vale's patient, smiling face, and the clock in the law office counting toward December. I need to ask you something, Silas said. She looked at him. He looked at the table for a moment, gathering what he needed to say into the right order. He was not a man who said things without knowing where they were going. I'm not going to dress this up, he said. I don't know how to dress things up, and I wouldn't try. What I'm going to ask is exactly what it sounds like, and I want you to hear it as exactly what it is, not more, not less. She was completely still. The hearing is in 6 weeks, Silas said. Pell is right that the second part of Vale's argument, the part about the household, is the part that has teeth. The inventory helps. The account books help. But when Vale's attorney stands up in that room and describes a widower alone on the plains with a 4-year-old child and no stable household to speak of, I need something that isn't just good records. He looked at her. I need you to know I'm not asking you this because it's convenient, he said. I don't do things because they're convenient. I do them because they make sense when I look at them from every angle. He stopped. And I've been looking at this from every angle for most of today. Lenora hadn't moved. Was watching him with the full focused attention she gave to things she was reading very carefully. I would like you to consider marrying me, Silas said. I'm not offering romance. I'm not pretending we're something we aren't. I'm offering a real household, a fair partnership, and the honest truth that what's been built here in the past 6 weeks is something I don't want to see stopped. He paused. I think you've made Maisie's life better. I think you've made this place better. And I think, if you were honest, you'd say it's been something real for you too. Hear this house, this situation, the word real again, the word she'd used. He'd chosen it deliberately. She looked at him for a long time. The wind pressed against the house. The fire gave its steady warmth. I have terms, Lenora said. He blinked. Something in his chest released slightly. All right. Maisie comes first, she said. Not the land, not the legal situation, not your pride. Her. Whatever decisions we make, that's the frame. Agreed. I won't be a wife who is managed, she said. I won't be someone you make decisions for and inform afterward. I've watched women get swallowed by that, and I won't do it. If we build this household together, I'm in it as an equal. I make decisions beside you. I'm not your dependent. I don't want a dependent, Silas said. I want someone who does exactly what you've been doing. She looked at him steadily. And I won't pretend for the town, she said. I won't put on a performance of something for the benefit of people in Briar Junction who have nothing to do with this house. What we are is what we are. That'll be enough, or it won't be. It'll be enough, Silas said. She was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now, not the working a problem quiet. Something more inward. I should tell you, she said, that I'm not easy to live with always. I go quiet when I'm troubled, and I don't always know how to come back out of it. I hold things too long. I have a particular opinion about how a kitchen ought to be organized that I recognize is excessive. She looked at him. I moved your harness. 3 times, he said. It was in the way. It was. He paused. You can move the harness. The not-quite smile. Then the real one. Small but real. The kind that reached her eyes in a way the other didn't quite. It was the first time he'd seen it. He registered it without making a production out of it. But he registered it. I'm not easy to live with either, he said. I go silent when things are hard. I make decisions without explaining my reasoning first, and then have to be asked. I burned the beans that one time, and I've burned them on other occasions as well. I know, she said. I could tell from the pot. He almost very nearly smiled. So we're both imperfect. Extremely, she said. The fire settled again. Maisie made a small sound from her alcove, the sound children make when they shift in deep sleep. All right, Lenora said. Just that. All right. The same way she said most things simple, direct, no ornamentation. He nodded. Neither of them moved for a moment. There was something slightly strange about the fact that a decision of this weight could be arrived at across a kitchen table in quiet voices while a 4-year-old slept in the next room and the wind moved across the Kansas plain outside. But that was what it was. And he thought, sitting there, that it was better this than the other way, better than declarations and ceremony and the performance of feelings for an audience. Better honest, better real. The terms are good, he said. She looked at the cradle. We should tell Maisie tomorrow, she said, before she hears it some other way. She'll want to know what it means, Silas said. I'll explain it. She'll have about 40 questions. I know, Lenora stood. She picked up the bowls from supper, which had been sitting at the end of the table this whole time. She carried them to the wash basin. I'll answer them. He watched her at the wash basin, the fire behind him, Cradle in the corner, the house around them both, holding the cold out. Thought about Clara. He thought about it directly, which he didn't often do. He thought about whether this was a kind of betrayal, and then he thought about it more carefully and understood that it wasn't that Clara would have been furious with him, actually, for the state of the food stores, and would have had a great deal to say about what 2 years of managing alone had done to the kitchen shelves. She'd been a practical woman. She would have approved of Lenora Wren in the way that practical women recognize each other. He didn't know if that made it easier, but it made it something other than what he'd been afraid it was. Lenora, he said. She turned from the wash basin. The cedar cradle, he said. Stays. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. She dried her hands. She went to the loft ladder and climbed it. He listened to her move across the loft floor, the sound of her sitting on the cot, the particular silence of a person removing their boots. Then quiet. He sat at the table a while longer, not thinking about the hearing or Vale or Pell's advice or the December date. Just sitting in the house with the fire and the wind and the cedar cradle with its cargo of a cornhusk doll and the complicated history of everything that had brought it to this corner. The morning they told Maisie came 2 days later, because it took Silas 2 days to figure out what he was actually going to say, and Lenora had apparently decided it was his place to say it and was not going to do it for him, which he understood and respected, and also found slightly unnerving. He sat Maisie at the table after breakfast, with her second cup of warm milk, and looked at her. I have something to tell you, he said. Maisie looked at him with the expression of someone bracing for information that might be unwelcome. She was 4. She'd already learned that adults announcing things at the breakfast table could go several ways. Lenora's going to stay, Silas said. Maisie looked at Lenora, who was standing by the stove with her cup of coffee and a carefully neutral face. She was already staying, Maisie said. Permanently, Silas said. She and I are going to get married. The kitchen was quiet. Maisie looked at Lenora. She looked at Silas. She looked at Lenora again. Does that mean she's my mama? Maisie asked. He'd known this question was coming and spent a significant amount of the previous evening deciding how to answer it. It means she's family, he said. What you want to call her is up to you. Maisie absorbed this. She turned to Lenora. What do you want me to call you? Maisie asked. Lenora came away from the stove. She pulled a chair out and sat down across from Maisie, which put them at eye level with each other. She looked at the child directly. That's a good question, she said. What would feel right to you? Maisie thought about this with the total seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Her warm milk was getting cold. My friend Adelaide Hurd calls her mother Mama, Maisie said. But Adelaide's mother smells like lavender. She looked at Lenora with the air of someone conducting a scientific assessment. You smell like bread and that thing you put in the stew. Time, Lenora said. That Maisie considered. Could I call you something that's just yours? Not what Adelaide calls hers. Lenora looked at her for a moment. What would you choose? She asked. Maisie thought. She looked at her milk. She looked at Nell, who was in the cradle across the room. She looked back at Lenora. Nora, she said. Because your name is Lenora, but Nora is the part that sounds like a person I know. Something moved across Lenora's face that she didn't manage to keep composed this time. It lasted only a second of something unguarded and clear before she brought herself back. Nora is good, she said. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and picked up her warm milk, which was now cold milk. Is there going to be a party? She asked. No, Silas said. Adelaide's cousin had a party when her parents got married. We're not Adelaide's cousin, Silas said. Can Nell come to whatever there is instead of a party? Yes, Lenora said. Maisie accepted this and drank her cold milk. They married on the first Saturday of November in the parlor of the county clerk's office, with the clerk himself as witness, and a woman from the clerk's office named Mrs. Doyle as the second, who had the look of someone who had witnessed a number of these quiet, practical unions and held them in the same regard as any other. Maisie stood between Silas and Lenora in her best dress, which Lenora had let out at the hem the week before, holding Nell in both arms. The clerk read the words. They said the words. They signed the document. Mrs. Doyle gave Maisie a piece of peppermint candy from her coat pocket, which Maisie received with the solemn gratitude of someone who understands that important days should be marked with something. They rode back to Raven Creek in the cold, Maisie between them on the wagon seat, leaning gradually as the miles went by, until she was asleep against Lenora's side, with Nell tucked between them. Lenora looked straight ahead at the road. Silas, plain stretched out around them, enormous and gray and real. He was aware, somewhere in his chest, of the particular weight of a decision that has been made and cannot be unmade. Not the weight of regret, not that. The weight of permanence, of having added something to your life that changes its shape in ways you can't fully see yet. He thought that weight was appropriate. He thought anyone who got married without feeling it probably wasn't paying attention. About 2 miles from the homestead, Lenora said, "Vale is going to hear about this by the end of the week." "I know," Silas said. "He's going to look for another angle." "Pell expects that." She glanced at him. "What does Pell think the next move is?" "He thinks Vale's attorney will try to argue that the marriage is strategic, that it was done in response to the claim, rather than from any genuine intention to maintain the household." "And how do we answer that?" Silas looked at the road. "We've been building this household for 2 months," he said. "Pell thinks the evidence of that, the meals, the repaired clothing, the organized stores, the relationship with Maisie, makes the argument hard to sustain." Lenora looked forward again. "Vale is going to be in that hearing room," she said, "sitting there with his pressed coat and his attorney and that paper in his pocket." "He is," Silas said, "and he's going to look at us and think he still has it." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't have it," she said. Not loudly, not with fire or anger. Just the same even, precise voice she used for everything. Statement of available fact. Silas looked at the homestead coming into view. Across the plain, the stone chimney, the smoke from the banked stove, the fence line running out from the yard in both directions. The land that had cost him Clara's labor and his own years and every hard winter since. The land his daughter had grown up on. The land he had built, stone by stone and post by post, into something that could not simply be taken away by a man in a pressed coat who had decided that suffering was the same as failing. "No," he said. "He doesn't." Maisie stirred between them. She didn't wake. She shifted slightly and burrowed deeper against Lenora's side. And Lenora's arm came around her with the automatic ease of something that had already become instinct. And the three of them rode the last 2 miles home through the cold in the last pale light of the November afternoon. And in the corner of the house that was waiting for them, in the old cedar cradle that had carried grief from Missouri and Nebraska and across the frontier, Cornhusk Doll slept in the particular piece of beloved objects that have finally found the place they belong. The news reached Briar Junction faster than Silas expected, which meant it reached Roderick Vale faster than Silas expected, which meant that by the following Tuesday a man appeared at the gate of Raven Creek Homestead on a horse that cost more than Silas's entire livestock shelter. Was at the fence along the east pasture when he heard the horse coming up the road. He straightened and turned. The man was not Vale, he was younger, better dressed than anyone who actually worked for a living, carrying a leather satchel across one shoulder. He had the particular posture of someone who's suited to law school and wanted you to know it. "Mr. Harrow?" he called from the gate. "That's me," Silas said. "My name is Aldrich Crane. I represent Roderick Vale in the matter of the land claim currently before the county hearing officer." He reached into the satchel and produced a document. "I'm serving you with a supplemental filing." He held the document out across the fence. Silas walked to the gate. He took the document without touching the man's hand. He looked at it, without opening it. "You rode 20 miles to hand me a paper," Silas said. "My client wanted to ensure you received it promptly," Crane said. Something in his tone was carefully calibrated, not hostile enough to be rude, not friendly enough to be anything else. particular voice of a lawyer who had been instructed to be visible. He wanted me to know he knows, Silas said. Crane didn't answer that directly. The filing addresses recent developments in the composition of your household, he said. We look forward to seeing you at the December hearing, Mr. Harrow. He turned his horse and rode back down the road. Silas stood at the gate with the document in his hand. He opened it. He read it twice. Then he walked back to the house. Lenora was inside, at the table, working on something with Maisie involving dried beans again, some kind of counting game that had apparently evolved into a sorting game based on the way the beans were arranged across the table in distinct piles. Maisie looked up when he came in. Lenora looked up a second later. She read his face before he said anything. What is it? She said. He set the document on the table. She picked it up and read it. He watched her eyes move across the page. Her expression didn't change, but she went through the particular focused stillness that meant she was taking in something she intended to think about carefully. She set it down. He's arguing that the marriage was strategically motivated, she said. Yes. He's filed a declaration from someone who claims to have overheard a conversation between you and me in the general store in Briar Junction. She looked at him. We've never had a conversation in the general store. I know. She looked at the document again. He says the witness saw us discussing the legal situation and heard me suggest the marriage as a solution to the claim problem. It didn't happen, Silas said. It didn't happen, she agreed. The closest thing to it was when I asked you about the claim on the street outside the land office, and I didn't suggest anything. I just asked about the situation. Maisie had stopped sorting her beans. She was looking between the two of them with the careful attention of a child who has learned that when adults stop talking, normally something important is happening. Who is the witness? Lenora asked. Someone named Pruitt. She looked up at him. Agnes Pruitt, she said. I can't tell from the document if that's the same. She sat with Maisie when we walked the property, Lenora said. She was in this house. She looked at the document with a different expression now, not quite anger, but something harder than her usual composure. She was sitting right there when I came in from the property walk, and she asked me about the claim. I answered briefly and changed the subject. Briefly how? I said something about the land being worth defending. That was all. I changed the subject because Maisie was in the room. She set the document down. Vale apparently decided that was worth reshaping. Silas sat down at the table. He looked at the document. Pell needs to know about this today, he said. He needs to know about Agnes Pruitt specifically, Lenora said. If we can establish that whatever she claims to have heard was here, in this house, not in the general store, it contradicts his filing's location. She was in this house, Maisie said. They both looked at her. Maisie was sitting very straight, her beans untouched in their piles, looking at her father, with the expression of a small person who has decided to contribute useful information. Agnes Pruitt came here, Maisie said. She sat in that chair. She pointed at beside the stove. She smelled like flour, and she told me my dress was too small, which Nora already knew. She looked at Lenora. Can I tell the man at the office that? Silas and Lenora looked at each other. Maybe, Silas said carefully. I remember things, Maisie said, with the unassailable confidence of someone who does, in fact, remember things. I remember she said that woman's got you working on Vale's problem, and Nora said that woman has a name, and Agnes made a face like this. Maisie produced a tight-mouthed expression of approximately Agnes Pruitt's displeasure, and then Nora talked about the beans. The kitchen was quiet. Lenora's jaw had tightened slightly. Silas looked at his daughter. You heard all that. I was under the table, Maisie said. People forget about under the table. He sent a letter to Pell that afternoon by the fastest route available, which was the mail rider who came through twice a week and could get a letter to the county seat in a day. He described the document, described Agnes Pruitt and the location discrepancy, and included a note about what Maisie had heard. He wasn't sure how much of it Pell could use. He wasn't sure how much of it was legally relevant. But Pell needed the whole picture. The reply came 3 days later. Pell's letter was terse and certain in the way that Pell's communications were when he had formed an opinion. The location discrepancy was significant. A 4-year-old's testimony was not admissible, but could be used to guide questioning of Agnes Pruitt herself. Most of its windows were dark, and Pell had done some additional inquiry of his own about Roderick Vale's pattern of behavior in the county that he wished to discuss in person before the hearing. He asked Silas to come to the county seat. He asked Lenora to come as well. That was new. They arranged for Maisie to stay with the Hurd family, Caleb Hurd and his wife Martha, who lived 3 miles east and who Maisie tolerated with relative good grace, because their daughter Adelaide was her closest approximation of a friend, even though Adelaide had once informed Maisie that her doll was not as nice as hers, which Maisie had not forgotten and was apparently aging like a stone in her small chest. The ride to the county seat took most of a day. Silas drove. Lenora sat beside him on the wagon seat. The November sky was doing its full performance iron gray, moving the kind of sky that promises nothing comfortable in the weeks ahead. They didn't talk for the first hour. This was not unusual for them. They had learned each other's silences well enough by now to know which kind. This was not the cold silence of conflict, not the complicated silence of things unsaid, but the working silence of two people who both had a great deal going on in their heads and were processing it in parallel. After a while, Lenora said, "Agnes Pruett came to this county 8 years ago with her husband. He died of fever 3 years back. She's been managing on her own since." Silas looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Martha Hurd told me when I arranged for Maisie to stay." "When did you ask Martha Hurd about Agnes Pruett?" "When I asked about a lot of things," Lenora said. "Martha Hurd is an excellent source of information about this county if you let her talk long enough." "Which I did, deliberately." He looked back at the road. "And Agnes Pruett has been doing occasional work for Vale," Lenora said. "Domestic work, housekeeping at his property, seasonal." Martha didn't think much of it, but it means Vale had access to her before this happened. It means she wasn't just a convenient witness, she was someone he already had a relationship with. Silas held that thought for a moment. "He put her in the house," Silas said. "I can't prove that, but I think he knew she'd be watching. I think her offer to sit with Maisie was not entirely her own idea." The wagon moved over the road. A hawk turned slow circles over the plain to the south. "You're saying he's been planning this longer than the claim filing," Silas said. "I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying Pell should know the connection between Vale and Agnes Pruett. I'll tell him." She nodded. She looked at the road. "I should have been more careful what I said in front of her," Lenora said. It was not self-flagellation she said it, the way she noted everything, as a fact to be filed and used. "I underestimated her. You couldn't have known. I could have been more careful regardless," she said. "I usually am." He didn't argue with her. He knew she wasn't asking to be absolved. She was adjusting her assessment. "We're careful from now on," he said. "We already were," she said. "We're more careful from now on." They rode in silence again for a while. Then, out of nowhere in particular, she said, "Did you ever find out why she didn't come? The woman from the letters?" He glanced at her. "Catherine Voss," he said. "Yes." He thought about it. "No, the telegram didn't explain. I didn't write to ask. Didn't see the point. Were you?" She paused in the way she did when she was choosing a word carefully. "Were you hurt by it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was relieved," he said, which surprised me. He kept his eyes on the road. "I'd been telling myself it was practical. The letters. The arrangement. I told myself I wasn't attached. But when the telegram came, I kept waiting to feel worse than I did, and the thing I actually felt was relief. Like something had been decided that I hadn't known how to decide myself." Lenora looked at him. "I don't think you wanted someone who came because of the advertisement," she said. He considered this. "I don't think I did," he said. "I think I wanted—" He stopped. "What?" He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. "Someone who came for a reason I could understand," he said. The wagon went on. The iron sky moved over them. And neither of them said anything more about it, which was exactly right, because some things are said once, and then they are simply present, underneath everything else, changing the shape of the air without being named. Pell's office looked the same as it had before. Same stacked documents, same 2 windows, same clock. The man himself looked slightly more tired, which Silas attributed to having spent 3 weeks in correspondence with Vale's attorney while trying to build a case out of evidence and law, rather than money and connections. He shook Lenora's hand when she came in. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. Silas noticed Lenora register the name without showing it. She'd been Lenora Wren for nearly 30 years and had been Lenora Harrow for 3 weeks, and the adjustment was still working itself out in small moments like this one. Mr. Pell, she said. They sat. Pell produced the supplemental filing and laid it on the desk. He had annotated it in the margins with small, precise notes. The location discrepancy is important, Pell said. The declaration places the conversation in the general store. If we can establish that no such conversation took place there and that any conversation Agnes Pruett witnessed occurred in your home, not a public location, it substantially weakens the credibility of the declaration. There's something else, Silas said. He told Pell about the connection between Vale and Agnes Pruett. The domestic work, the seasonal employment, the timing of her offer to sit with Maisie. Pell listened without interrupting. He picked up his pen and made a note. If that connection can be established, Pell said, it goes to bias. A witness who is employed by the opposing party has an obvious interest in the outcome and can use that to undermine the weight of her testimony with the hearing officer. Can you establish it? Lenora asked. I can ask the right questions, Pell said. If she's been paid regularly enough, there will be records. Vale pays by bank draft. He considers cash beneath him, which is occasionally useful. He made another note. I'll look into it. He set the pen down and looked at both of them. There is something else I want to tell you, he said. I've been making inquiries about Vale's history in this county, his pattern with homesteaders. He paused. This is not the first claim he has pursued in this way. There are at least 4 other homesteaders in the past 3 years who received similar filings, technically grounded challenges backed by exaggerated arguments about household instability. Silas felt the cold anger settle in his chest again. What happened to them? He asked. Pell was quiet for a moment. 2 of them settled, he said, sold part of their acreage to Vale at below market prices rather than face the cost and uncertainty of a hearing. One family had the claim dismissed, but left the county anyway. They were exhausted and couldn't afford to fight the next challenge when it came. He looked at his desk. The 4th family won their hearing outright. Their case established a precedent that Vale's attorney has been trying to work around ever since. What was the difference? Lenora asked. With the 4th family. Pell looked at her. Documentation, he said, and a hearing officer who read it carefully. She nodded once. Who is the hearing officer for December? She asked. A man named Elias Corbett, Pell said. He's been the hearing officer in this county for 11 years. He's not friendly to Vale in particular, but he is not friendly to anyone. He follows the law and the evidence, and that is all he follows. He looked at them both. Which means if we walk in with documentation that is thorough and credible and witnesses who can substantiate it, we have a real argument. And if we walk in with anything less than that, it's relying on his goodwill, which I wouldn't recommend relying on. The inventory is thorough, Silas said. I know. I've been through it 3 times. Pell looked at Lenora. You did excellent work. I'll do it again before December if anything needs updating, she said. The livestock numbers, Pell said. If anything has changed since you compiled it additions, losses update the count and date the revision. Corbett will appreciate accuracy over impression. Update it. Pell leaned back. I also want 2 witnesses in that room. People who can speak to the condition of the homestead, the continuous occupation, the functioning of the household. People who have been to Raven Creek and can describe what they saw. Caleb heard, Silas said immediately. He witnessed the chimney construction and the fence setting. He's been on the property a dozen times. Good. Who else? Silas thought. A woman named Martha Hurd, his wife. She's been in the house. She can speak to the household. Pell looked at Lenora. I'd like Martha Hurd to speak primarily to the period after Mrs. Harrow's arrival, he said carefully. I want the hearing officer to understand that the household is functioning as a unit, not that a hired woman is managing things while the homesteader struggles. The picture I want him to see is a working family. 2 adults and a child maintaining a productive claim. Martha will say what she saw, Lenora said. What she saw is what you want the hearing officer to know. Pell nodded. Good. They left the county seat in the early afternoon. Sky had not improved while they were inside. The cold was the kind that didn't announce itself loudly, but accumulated over miles. The kind didn't realize had gotten into your coat until you'd been riding in it long enough. Lenora had her hands in her lap under the lap blanket, and Silas was aware that she was cold before she said anything about it, which she didn't. He reached behind the seat and got the second blanket from the storage box and handed it to her. She took it without comment and put it over the first one. Thank you, she said. About a mile out of town, she said. 4 families. He's done this to 4 families. At least 4, Silas said. 2 of them gave up acreage just to make it stop. I know, she was quiet for a moment. The wheels of the wagon found a rough patch of road, and she put her hand on the seat to steady herself. He's been his land holdings by targeting the people least able to fight him, she said. Widowers, families with debt, people who can't afford an attorney or can't lose the time the fight takes. She looked at the road ahead. He picked you because of the telegram, because you looked like you'd just lost the thing that might have let you hold on. He wasn't wrong about what I'd lost, Silas said. He was wrong about what you had left, she said. He drove. Plain opened up around them in the late afternoon light, gray gold and vast, the way it got in November when the sun came through the clouds at an angle and made everything look both beautiful and serious at the same time. If we win this, Silas said, it doesn't stop him. He'll find another family. I know. Pell can't do anything about that. I know that too, Lenora said. She looked at the horizon. But we can tell what happened after. We can make sure the herds know, and the herds will tell people, and the 4th family who won before us, Pell, said they set a precedent. Maybe what we build on top of that precedent means the next family has something to stand on too. He thought about that. One thing at a time, he said. Yes, she said. December 1st. They rode on. The weeks between the attorney's office and the hearing were not easy weeks. They were the weeks that the practical weight of everything arrived all at once, the legal preparation, the ongoing work of the homestead, the deepening cold that made every chore twice as hard, and underneath all of it the low constant hum of dread that Silas had gotten good at ignoring, but that Lenora, he noticed, handled differently. She didn't ignore it. She worked it. She updated the inventory 3 times once when 2 of the cattle were moved to a different pasture, and she wanted the grazing records accurate. Once when she found a discrepancy between the account book and her property notes about the date of the livestock shelter repair, and once the week before the hearing when she went through everything from the beginning and checked every figure and date against every source. She did this at the kitchen table in the evenings after Maisie was in bed, and Silas sat in the room with her, or didn't. But the work was always there when he came in and always looked slightly more complete than the last time he'd seen it. He watched her work and thought about what Pell had said. Documentation. The 4th family won because of documentation. Lenora was building them the same thing the 4th family had, not because a lawyer told her to, because she had looked at the situation from every angle, the way she looked at everything, and understood that truth needed architecture to stand up in a room full of people who were paid to argue against it. Maisie, for her part, was managing the anxiety of the approaching hearing in the particular way of children, which was to mostly not know about it and proceed with life, but to become slightly more clingy in the evenings in a way she probably couldn't have explained. She wanted Lenora to tuck her in more nights than usual. She wanted to hear stories, not the made-up ones she normally requested from Silas, but stories about real things. What was Nebraska like? What did Nora's sister Pearl look like? What did it feel like to ride on a train? Lenora sat on the edge of Maisie's bed on the nights. Maisie asked for her and answered these questions with the same even patience she brought to everything. She described Nebraska with the honesty of someone who had found it both difficult and real. She described Pearl as someone who laughed easily and made good bread and had a particular opinion about the correct way to braid hair. She described the train as very loud and smelling of coal smoke and not particularly comfortable, but going fast enough to make your heart do something. Silas heard these conversations through the thin wall between the alcove and the main room. He didn't mean to listen. He just couldn't not. He heard Maisie ask, one night, whether Pearl would have liked her. There was a pause. Yes, Lenora said. She would have thought you were something. What kind of something? The good kind, Lenora said. The kind that makes you pay attention. He heard Maisie consider this. Do you miss her? Maisie asked. Another pause. Yes, Lenora said. But missing someone doesn't have to be the same as being sad all the time. Sometimes it's just like there's a place in you that knows they existed, and that place doesn't go away. It just gets quieter. He heard Maisie settle in her bed. Like when I miss Mama, Maisie said. Yes, Lenora said quietly. Like that. He stood in the main room for a long moment, not moving, one hand against the wall. He had held Clara's memory for 2 years, the tightest possible grip. The way you hold something you're terrified to put down because you're not sure what it means if you can carry it a different way. He hadn't talked to Maisie about it enough, he knew that. He'd answered questions when they came and avoided provoking them when they didn't, and told himself that was protection, and suspected underneath that it was something else. Lenora had just done in 2 minutes what he hadn't managed in 2 years. Not replacing, not overwriting, just naming it clearly. You miss her. Yes, like that. Like when I miss Pearl. We both carry something. That's all right. That's what it is. He went to the window and looked out at the dark plain. The night before the hearing, neither of them slept well. He knew she wasn't sleeping because the loft was quiet in the wrong way, not the deep silence of unconsciousness, but the controlled silence of someone lying still and thinking. He wasn't sleeping because he was doing the same thing. He got up at 3 a.m. and built the fire in the stove. He put water on. He sat at the table. Lenora came down the loft ladder about 10 minutes later. She didn't say anything about not being able to sleep. She sat across from him and wrapped her hands around the cup of coffee he poured without asking. They sat in the dark kitchen with the fire going and the night outside, and the hearing 13 hours away. If it goes wrong, Silas said. It won't, she said. But if it does, she looked at him across the table. Then we figure out what comes next, she said. The land matters. But it's not the only thing. It's Maisie's home, he said. I know. It's where stopped. Lenora waited. It's where Clara is buried, he said. Back of the east pasture, under the cottonwood. I put stones. He looked at the table. I can't lose that. Kitchen was very quiet. I know, Lenora said. And the way she said it was different from the practical even tone she usually used. It was quieter than that, like she was saying it from somewhere specific. He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. Pearl is in Nebraska, she said. I don't have a place I can go to. She paused. Your east pasture is something I understand better than you might think. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, We're not going to lose it. Up. No, she said, we're not. The fire did its work. The wind moved over the plain in the particular way it did before dawn, lower and more serious than the daytime wind, the wind that seemed to come from further away. At 6 a.m, Maisie woke up and came into the kitchen and found both of the already dressed and the kitchen warm and biscuits on the stove because Lenora had started them at 4:30. Maisie looked at the biscuits. She looked at both of them. Is today the day? She asked. Today is the day, Silas said. Maisie climbed into her chair. She held Nell in her lap. Will you win? She asked. Silas opened his mouth. Yes, Lenora said. He looked at her. She was looking at Maisie, steady as the chimney. Maisie nodded once as though this settled it. Oak, she said. Can I have 2 biscuits? Caleb and Martha Hurd arrived at 8:30 to collect Maisie. Martha had a round, capable face, the manner of a woman who had been a fixture of frontier life long enough to find drama slightly tiresome and logistics satisfying. She looked at the two of them with an appraising eye when she came in, took stock of the situation, and said only, I'll have her fed and in bed by 7. You just focus on what you're going to do. Maisie went with Adelaide without significant protest, though she looked back from the wagon seat. Bring Nell, Lenora had told her, pressing the doll into her hands at the door. She's never been to Adelaide's, Maisie said. She'll manage, Lenora said. Maisie looked at her. Will you be back by dark? She asked. We'll be back, Lenora said. I promise. She didn't promise things she wasn't sure of. Maisie knew this. The child looked at her for one more second, then turned to the wagon. Silas and Lenora rode toward the county seat. The land office building in the county seat was 2 stories of stone with a wooden sign that said land office in plain letters and a door that was heavier than it looked. The hearing room was on the ground floor, a rectangular space with a long table at the front, a row of chairs along each wall, and a raised platform behind the long table where Elias Corbett would sit. They arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled time. Roderick Vale was already there. He was standing near the front of the room with Aldrich Crane beside him and 2 other men Silas didn't know. Vale was in his pressed coat, the same one, touching the paper in his breast pocket with the tip of one finger the way he always did, the way a man touches a thing he's decided will hurt someone. He looked at Silas when he came in. Then he looked at Lenora. He smiled, not warmly, The way a man smiles when he thinks he has anticipated everything. Silas looked at him the way he'd looked at him on the street in Briar Junction, not with heat, with the cold, steady anger that had been keeping him upright since October. He found his chair on the right side of the room and sat down. Lenora sat beside him. Pell arrived 4 minutes later with the inventory document and the account books in his case, and the particular manner of a man who has read the situation carefully and is ready for it. Caleb Hurd arrived shortly after, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in a way that meant he'd put on his better coat for the occasion. Martha came in behind him. Agnes Pruitt was already in the room, across the aisle, not looking at anyone. Lenora saw her, said nothing, looked forward. Elias Corbett came in at exactly 10 o'clock. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with a gray mustache that was precise to the point of severity, and the eyes of someone who had heard a great deal of argument in his lifetime and had sorted it into useful and not useful, and was not particularly patient with the second category. He sat down behind the long table without preamble. This is the hearing of the land dispute filed by Roderick Vale against the homestead claim of Silas Harrow, Corbett said. I've reviewed the filings and the supplemental filings from both parties. We will proceed with opening statements. Mr. Crane, you filed, so you'll go first. Aldrich Crane stood. He was smooth. Silas had to give him that. The man had the polished delivery of someone who had stood in enough rooms like this that it no longer made him nervous, and he laid Vale's case out with the confident clarity of someone who believed in the strength of his material. The homestead claim, he said, while technically meeting early improvement thresholds, had been in progressive decline over the past 2 years since the death of the claimant's wife. Livestock counts had fluctuated. Maintenance had slipped. Claimant had made a public attempt to recruit a mail-order bride, which had failed, indicating his own recognition that he could not sustain the claim alone. Arrest of its marriage entered into just weeks before the hearing had the clear hallmarks of a strategic arrangement rather than a genuine household, and testimony would establish that this very arrangement had been discussed and planned as a legal tactic. He sat down. Pell stood. He was not smooth. He was something better. He was exact. He said that the burden of proof in a homestead challenge required demonstrating not the claimant's imperfection, but the actual abandonment or failure of the claim. He said that the documentation he was entering into evidence, the inventory, cross-reference to 5 years of account books, substantiated by 2 witnesses present in this room, would demonstrate continuous improvement, continuous occupation, and continuous viability of Raven Creek Homestead from the date of first claim to the present day. He said that the claimant was not a struggling widower. He was a man who had built a stone chimney with his own hands, sunk a well 30 feet, fenced 160 acres over 3 summers, and maintained records precise enough to be audited to the penny. He said that the claim of an unstable household was predicated on a declaration from a witness with a documented financial relationship with the opposing party, Snatch, which he would establish in questioning. Down. Corbett looked at the room over his mustache. Let's see the documentation, he said. Pell stood and placed the inventory and the account books on the hearing table. Corbett picked up the inventory and read it with the attention of someone reading a legal document, not the attention of someone performing the act of reading. He turned pages. He stopped on certain entries and read them twice. Silas watched Corbett read. He did not watch Vale. He had spent enough time watching Vale. He looked at Corbett reading the document that Lenora had built her graphite stick in her careful hand in the evenings after Maisie slept. And he thought about how she'd walked the full boundary in the bitter cold with her journal and his extra coat and asked questions about the well depth and the chimney mortar, and who had witnessed the fence setting. She had understood from the very beginning what the land needed to be defended, not just the acreage, the truth of it, the documented, substantiated, line-by-line truth of 6 years of a man's life on a piece of Kansas plain. Corbett set the inventory down. He picked up the account books and paged through them with the same methodical attention. The room was quiet enough that the clock on the wall was audible. Vale was still. Silas could feel it from across the room, the quality of his stillness, not Silas's kind of stillness, not the kind that had learned patience from hard work, kind that was holding something back. Corbett set the account books down. He looked at Pell. Your witnesses, he said. Caleb Hurd took the chair beside the hearing table when Pell called him and answered questions with the straightforward brevity of a man who is uncomfortable with ceremony but certain of his facts. He had seen the chimney laid. He had worked 3 days of the fence, setting on the north boundary. He had been to Raven Creek homestead not less than a dozen times in 6 years and had never seen it in a state that suggested a best abandonment or failure. Martha Hurd was different. She was not brief. She was thorough in the way of a woman who understood that thorough was what was needed and was not going to leave anything on the table because she was worried about taking too much time. She described the homestead as she had seen it in October and in November and in the 2 visits she had made since. She described the kitchen, the food stores, the condition of the children's clothing. She described Maisie's health and her manner, and the quality of her care. She described Lenora Harrow, as a woman who had come to a situation that needed steadying and had steadied it, practically and competently and without any need for performance. Crane cross-examined her. He asked about the timing of Lenora's arrival. He asked about the notice Silas had posted. He asked whether the marriage had been discussed in practical terms before it occurred. Martha Hurd looked at him with the expression of a woman who has raised 4 children, survived 12 Kansas winters, and is not afraid of a young attorney in a good coat. 2 adults deciding to make a household permanent is not a scheme, she said. It is the most ordinary human decision there is. Unless Mr. Vales has some objection to ordinary human decisions. There was a small sound from the chairs along the wall that might have been a suppressed reaction from someone who was not a party to the dispute. Corbett's mustache moved slightly. Pell called Agnes Pruitt. She came to the chair with the look of a woman who had convinced herself that what she was doing was reasonable and was finding that conviction harder to maintain now that she was in the room. She was small, neat, with hands that she kept folded in her lap. Crane led her through her declaration. She described a conversation she had overheard in the general store in Briar Junction between Silas Harrow and a woman she did not then know by name, in which the woman had suggested the marriage as a solution to the land claim. She described it specifically and clearly, the way someone describes something they have rehearsed. Pell stood for cross-examination. He asked her the date. She gave it. He asked her the time of day. She gave it. He asked her whether she was certain of the location, the general store. Specifically. She was certain. Pell picked up a document.
Mrs. Pruitt,
he said,
I have here a record from Mr.
Silas Harrow's account at the general store in Briar Junction. The account shows his last purchase, before the date you've described, was 3 weeks prior. He did not visit the store on the date you've named. Silence. Additionally, Pell said, I have here records from the Briar Junction Bank showing regular payments from Roderick Vale to Agnes Pruitt for domestic services, the most recent of which was made 4 days after the supplemental declaration you signed was filed with this office. The room had a particular quality of stillness now. Agnes Pruitt's folded hands moved against each other in her lap. Mrs. Pruitt, Pell said, not unkindly. Is it possible that the conversation you believe you heard did not take place in the general store? She was quiet for a long moment. She started. I'd like a direct answer, Corbett said from behind the table. Agnes Pruitt looked at her hands. Then she looked at Corbett. I may have misremembered the location, she said. Crane was very still. Vale was very still. Pell said, no further questions. Corbett looked at Vale's side of the room for a long moment. Then he looked at his documents. He straightened the inventory on the table in front of him, with 2 fingers aligning it precisely. I've heard the evidence, he said. I'll take 30 minutes to review the documentation before I issue my ruling. He stood. He left the room. Silas sat in his chair and looked at the floor in front of him. He was aware of Lenora sitting beside him, not touching him, not saying anything, doing the same thing he was doing, holding it steady. 30 minutes. He heard Vale say something to Crane in a low voice. He didn't look. The clock on the wall made its noise. People in the chairs shifted. Someone near the back of the room coughed. Lenora's hand, which had been in her lap, moved to the bench between them. Not toward him. Just open. Resting there. He looked at it. He put his hand next to hers on the bench. Not holding. Just next to it. Neither of them moved. The clock counted the minutes. At minute 27, Elias Corbett came back into the room. He sat down. He looked at his documents. He looked at the room. The challenge filed by Roderick Vale against the homestead claim of Silas Harrow is dismissed, he said. He said several other things about the sufficiency of the evidence of continuous improvement, about the failure of the opposing documentation to meet the evidentiary standard required for a valid challenge, about the unreliability of the declaration, given the demonstrated financial relationship between the declarant and the challenging party. Silas, the words, he understood them. He understood them. The way you understand something when you have been waiting for it for long enough that when it arrives you need a moment to let it be real. He looked at the floor. He heard Pell saying something. He heard Vale's chair move. He heard Crane's voice lower, and then the door. He looked up. Vale was leaving, not rushing too proud for that, but leaving. Crane held the door. Vale walked through it without looking back, without the smile, without touching the paper in his breast pocket. Just gone. Pell was beside Silas now, saying something about the paperwork, about the record, about getting copies. Silas nodded at the right moments. Caleb Hurd clapped him once on the shoulder with the heavy hand of a man expressing something he doesn't have the words for. Martha said something warm that he would remember better later. He turned to Lenora. She was standing beside him, coat buttoned, the same composed expression she always wore. But something in it was different. Something had come loose at the edges, not in a falling apart way. The way a thing loosens when the pressure that was holding it tight is finally removed. She looked at him. Maisie is at the herds, she said. We told her we'd be back by dark. We will be, he said. She nodded once. They walked out of the land office into the November afternoon. The cold hit them immediately, a flat, serious cold, the kind that had arrived in the last week, and was not planning to leave until April. The sky was the same iron gray it had been all month. Silas stood on the step for a moment, breathing it in. Lenora stood beside him. You all right? She asked. He thought about it. I think so, he said. Ask me again when we're home. She looked at the street. The word had shifted slightly between them, just then home, the way a word does when it stops being a location and becomes something else. Something with more weight. Come on then, she said. They walked to where the wagon was hitched and climbed up and turned toward Raven Creek. There was a little daylight left, not much, but enough. They made it back to the herd place before full dark, but only barely. The last of the light was sitting flat and orange on the horizon when Silas turned the wagon into Caleb Hurd's yard, and Maisie was already at the window. He could see her small shape pressed against the glass before he'd even stopped the horse. She came through the door before they'd climbed down. She didn't run to Silas. She ran to Lenora. Lenora caught her without stumbling, which said something about how instinctive the whole thing had become, and Maisie wrapped both arms around her neck and held on with the particular grip of a child who has been managing anxiety all day by pretending not to have any. You came back, Maisie said into Lenora's shoulder. I told you I would, Lenora said. I know, a pause. Adelaide's doll is ugly. Lenora made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. It's not kind. It's true, Maisie said, still not letting go. Nell is better. Martha Hurd appeared in the doorway behind them, with the expression of someone who had spent an afternoon managing a child's carefully contained worry and was very glad to be handing her back. Caleb came in the barn a few minutes later, and there was a brief exchange on the porch. Silas, men shaking Caleb's hand in the thank each other way, for things that don't have adequate words. Martha pressing a jar of something preserved into Lenora's hands, without asking if she wanted it. Hearing went well, I take it, Martha said. It wasn't really a question. She was reading their faces. Dismissed, Silas said. Martha pressed her lips together in a firm line that meant deep satisfaction. Good, she said. That man has been needing someone to tell him no for 3 years. They rode back to Raven Creek with Maisie between them on the wagon seat, which was where she always ended up. Nell held in her arms. The night had come fully down by then, and the cold was complete and serious. The kind of cold that makes the stars look closer because the air is so clear. Maisie lasted about a mile before she was asleep, listing sideways against Lenora the same way she always did, and Lenora put her arm around her, without interrupting whatever she was thinking about. The homestead was dark when they pulled up to it, which was expected. They'd banked the fire before they left that morning. But it was still standing. The stone chimney rose against the night sky. The fence line ran out from the yard in both directions. The well sat where it had always sat. The east pasture behind the house was invisible in the dark, but Silas knew exactly where it was, knew the shape of it the way you know the shape of something you've walked 1,000 times. He sat on the wagon for a moment after he stopped the horse, just looking at it. Lenora looked at him looking at it. She didn't say anything. He climbed down. He took Maisie from her, still asleep, carrying her the way you carry a sleeping child carefully, balanced, aware that the weight of them is a specific kind of precious. He got her inside and into her bed, and she stirred once and said something that wasn't quite a word and then went back under without waking. He stood in the doorway of the alcove for a moment. Lenora had come in behind him and rebuilt the fire in the stove. He could hear the first tentative crackling of it from the other room. He stood there listening to his daughter breathe and listening to the fire catch, and thought about the fact that both of those sounds were happening at the same time in the same house on a piece of land that was still theirs. He went back to the main room. The fire was taking hold. Lenora was standing at the stove with her coat still on, her back to him, doing something with the kettle. The cedar cradle sat in its corner with Nell missing from it. Maisie had taken the doll to the Herzogs, and presumably it was somewhere in the bed with her now. "Sit down," Lenora said without turning. "I'll make something hot." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. He sat down. She made coffee. She put the cups on the table and sat across from him, and they sat in the warm kitchen with the fire building and the night outside and the particular silence of a house where the hard thing is over and the ordinary thing can start. He looked at his cup. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, because he was a man who didn't say things until he knew what he was saying, and this one had been working itself into shape for several weeks. "When I wrote that notice," he said, "the second one, the one that went out, I put that last line in about Maisie. I don't know why exactly. I was tired. I'd written it in a bad mood, and I wasn't thinking carefully." He looked at his cup. "But I think the honest answer is that I put it in because I needed someone to understand that she was the reason. Not the land, not the winter, not the food stores. Her," he paused. "And you were the only person who answered like you understood that." Lenora was watching him with the steady attention she gave to things that mattered. "You wrote back to my questions," she said, "about sleeping arrangements and the child's health and the distance to town. You answered all three. Most men answered the practical ones and skipped the one about the child. The child was the practical one," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." He looked at her. She looked back. There was something between them now that hadn't been there in October. Not the careful arrangement of two practical people making a sensible decision. Not the legal construct of a household formed to answer a land claim. Something that had grown up underneath both of those things, slower and quieter, the way the most real things tend to grow not announced, not performed, just present one day when you look at what's in front of you, honestly. He was not a man who said things like this easily. He had not said them to Clara easily either, and she'd known it and loved him anyway, which was part of what had made her remarkable. He understood that the inability to say a thing did not mean the thing wasn't true, but he also understood, sitting in this kitchen at the end of this day, that some things needed to be said out loud at least once, so that both people knew they were operating with the same information. "I'm glad you came," he said, "not because of the hearing, not because of what you did for the case, though it mattered more than I can say. Because of," he stopped, started again, "because of what this house is now versus what it was. Because of who Maisie is now versus who she was 3 months ago." He looked at the table. "Because I stopped sleeping with the feeling that everything was about to come apart." The fire settled in the stove. The night pressed against the windows. "Silas," Lenora said. He looked up. "I know," she said. "Just that." But the way she said it, the way her voice, had the particular quality of something that has been held carefully for a long time and is finally being set down, told him that she meant the full version of what he'd said, and more, and that she was carrying the same information he was. She picked up her coffee cup. "Pearl would have liked you," she said. She had a weakness for stubborn people who were secretly kinder than they let on. He looked at her. "I'm not kind," he said. "You carried Maisie inside tonight like she was made of glass," Lenora said. "You've been keeping her mother's memory for 2 years because you didn't know how to put it down gently. You wrote a blunt, unsentimental notice that was the most obviously heartbroken document I've ever read, and you put your daughter's name in it because you didn't know how else to say what you needed. She looked at him across the table. You're kind, she said. You're just not showy about it. He was quiet for a long moment. Pearl sounds like she was something, he said. She was the good kind of something, Lenora said. The words echoed what she'd said to Maisie through the wall, and he heard the echo, and she knew he heard it. Kind that makes you pay attention. He nodded slowly. He picked up his cup. To Pearl, he said. A simple... Lenora looked at her cup. Then at his, she raised hers slightly. And to Clara, she said. He raised his. They drank their coffee in the warm kitchen with the fire and the night, and the cedar cradle sitting empty in the corner, and it was not a sad moment. It was a real one, the kind that acknowledged what has been lost without pretending the losing was anything other than what it was, and then keeps going, because keeping going is what the living are obligated to do and what the lost, if they were the people you think they were, would have wanted. The weeks after the hearing had their own particular quality. It was not euphoria. Silas had not been built for euphoria and didn't trust it on principle. Which is something quieter than that of settling, the way a house settles if NASA. After a storm has stormed, and you go through checking for damage and find that the things that mattered have held. The tension that had been running underneath everything since October, gradually, unevenly, came down from the level that had made every morning feel like preparation for something bad. Vale did not come back. His name circulated in the county the way bad reputations circulate with the particular forward momentum of a story people want to tell because they find the ending satisfying. Pell had sent him a letter after the hearing that Silas was not privy to, but which Pell described, with more satisfaction than he usually showed, as comprehensive. Agnes Pruitt was seen less often in Briar Junction. Two homesteaders who had sold acreage to Vale under pressure were not going to get their land back, which was a wrong that the hearing couldn't right. Most of its windows, and Silas thought about them sometimes with the dull anger of a man who has won something, while knowing the winning doesn't cover everything that was lost. That was the thing nobody told you about winning a thing like this. The relief was real. The relief was significant. But it didn't come packaged with justice for everything that had happened, just the specific thing in front of you. Vale still had money. He still had a lawyer. He would find another angle eventually somewhere against someone who was more isolated or more desperate or less equipped. Silas mentioned this to Lenora one evening in January. She was mending something by the fire, one of his shirts, a tear along the left shoulder seam that had been getting wider for a month. Maisie was asleep. I know, she said. I think about it too. Pell can't stop him from doing it to someone else. No, she said. She pulled the thread through. But the precedent the fourth family set helped us. And what we did in December adds to it. The next family who fights him has more to stand on. If they know to use it, she looked up. That's a different problem, she said. That's a problem about whether people who are struggling know what resources exist. That's a problem about whether Gideon Pell has a way to reach the family's Vale targets before they give up. She looked back at the shirt. That's a problem worth thinking about after February. He watched her sew. You're already thinking about it, he said. She paused. I may have written a letter to Pell last week, she said, asking whether there was a way to make the inventory method available to other families facing claims. Something documented that they could use as a template. He was quiet. You didn't mention that, he said. I wasn't sure you'd want me to involve Pell again so quickly after. Lenora, he said. She looked up. You don't ask my permission for things like that, he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Equal partners, she said. Equal partners, he said. She went back to the shirt. He wrote back, she said. He thinks it's worth pursuing in the spring. He knows two other homesteaders currently dealing with similar filings from different landholders. If they're willing, he'd like to share the model. Silas looked at the fire. Tell him yes, he said. She nodded. She finished the seam. The winter did what Kansas winters did, which was to make everything harder than it needed to be for longer than seemed reasonable. February in particular was the month Lenora had warned about from the beginning, the month that always ran long, that emptied stores faster than you'd planned for, that made the distance between the homestead and Briar Junction feel like the distance between the homestead and the moon. But the root cellar held. The turnips she'd insisted on in October, the dried apple, the extra cornmeal, the careful organization of what needed to come out, first it held. Silas had gone into February. braced for the familiar thinness of the last weeks of winter, the scraping, the barrel quality that he'd managed to normalize because he didn't have a choice, and instead found that things were adequate in a way he hadn't planned for. He mentioned this one morning in mid-February, when the temperature outside was the kind of number that made you question your commitment to frontier living, and the cellar had just yielded a fine collection of root vegetables for the evening soup. "You planned this in October," he said. Lenora was chopping. "I planned for February always being worse than expected," she said. "That's different from planning. That's assuming the worst and buying turnips accordingly." "It worked. The turnips worked," she said. "Don't give me credit for vegetables. I'm giving you credit for the thinking behind the vegetables." She glanced at him sideways. "All right," she said. "You can give me credit for the thinking." Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair at maximum disorder, which was its usual morning state, and announced that Nell had had a bad dream and needed breakfast. "Dolls don't dream," Silas said. "Nell does," Maisie said with absolute certainty. "What do dolls dream about?" Lenora asked, still chopping. Maisie considered this. "Probably about not getting left places," she said. She climbed into her chair and arranged Nell on the table in front of her, facing the stove, apparently so the doll could watch breakfast being made. Silas sat down across from her and looked at his daughter, her wild hair, her matter-of-fact manner, her absolute comfort in this kitchen, in this chair, in the ordinary morning of her life, and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. Not happiness exactly, though there was that. Something more specific. Something that knew what had almost been taken. Lenora set a bowl of porridge in front of Maisie and a cup of coffee in front of Silas and sat down with her own. Nell's portion said. Maisie looked at him. She already ate. Of course she did. Lenora hid something behind her coffee cup. The day Silas built the second porch chair came in the first week of March, when the cold had started its long retreat, and there were days now where the afternoon was almost bearable. He'd been planning it for a while without saying anything, the way he did most things, working it out in his head first, the joinery and the lumber and the dimensions, making sure it was right before he started. The porch already had one chair. It had had one chair since he'd built the porch, which was 2 years ago now, and he'd sat in it in the evenings, sometimes in summer when the work was done, and there was still enough light to sit in. One chair, the particular furniture of a solitary life. He worked on the second chair in the barn over several evenings. Good lumber, not scrap. He'd kept a few boards back from a delivery in the fall for exactly this purpose, without telling himself that's what they were for. He took his time with the joinery. He wanted it to match the first one. Maisie found him working on it one evening and stood in the barn doorway, watching with the expression of someone conducting an inquiry. "What's that?" she asked. "Chair," he said. "We have a chair. Now we'll have two." She thought about this. "For the porch?" she asked. "That's the plan." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the half-built chair on the bench. "Is it for Nora?" she asked. He kept working. "Someone ought to have a place to sit," he said. "Process this." "She stands a lot," Maisie said. "When she's thinking, she stands by the window." "I know. Maybe she'd sit more if there was a chair." "That's the theory," he said. Maisie came further into the barn and climbed onto a hay bale to watch him work. She was quiet in the way she got when she was absorbing something, not asking questions, just being present. "Papa," she said after a while. Are you happy now?" He kept planing the board. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Think so," he said, getting there. "Nora's happier than when she came," Maisie said. "She smiles more. Real ones," she paused. "She has two kinds. The almost one and the real one. She does the real one more now." He stopped planing. He looked at his daughter sitting on the hay bale in the barn, with the seriousness of a small philosopher who has been paying close attention to the people around her and drawing accurate conclusions. "You notice it," he said. "I notice everything," Maisie said, without any vanity about it, as a fact. He went back to planing. "Good," he said. He finished the chair on a Saturday and brought it out to the porch in the afternoon and set it beside first one. He went back inside without making an announcement about it. Lenora was in the kitchen. He heard her go out to the porch a little while later, heard the back door, heard her footsteps cross the boards. A pause. Then the sound of a chair being pulled slightly, adjusted, sat in. He didn't go out. She didn't call him. But when he came to the kitchen window a while later, She was sitting in it with her face turned toward the south field and her hands in her lap, and she was not doing anything. Not working, not planning, not solving a problem. Just sitting in the March afternoon in a chair that had been made for her by a man who had not said that's what it was for, and resting, which was something he had never once seen her do voluntarily. That, he thought, was the closest thing to a declaration he was capable of. Apparently it was enough, because she sat in that chair every evening that week when the work was done. Spring arrived the way it always did on the Kansas plain gradually, and then all at once, the white you turn around one day, and the thing that was gray is green, and you can't quite account for the transition. The east pasture came back first. The grass finding its way up through the winter-pressed ground with the reliable stubbornness of things that have survived difficult conditions before and know how to do it again. Silas turned the cattle out onto the pasture in the third week of April and watched them move into it from the fence and felt the particular satisfaction of a man whose land is doing what land is supposed to do. The 40 acres that Vale had tried to claim, the grazing land and the well, all of it still Harrow land, documented and defended, and now producing in the ordinary way of good land that has been well tended. He leaned on the fence for a while. Lenora came and stood beside him. She'd been in the vegetable garden, which she was expanding this year. She'd drawn him a plan in February, laid it out on the kitchen table with her pencil, showing what could go, where and why, and the plan was more ambitious than anything he'd attempted on his own, but made complete sense when she explained the reasoning. She had dirt on her hands. She wiped them on her apron. The north corner of the garden needs the fence raised, she said. Something's been getting in. I'll look at it this afternoon. Could be rabbits. Could be. She leaned on the fence beside him and looked at the cattle in the pasture. The April light was the kind that made everything look a little more itself, the green more green, the brown of the fence more brown, the sky a particular shade of blue that only existed in Kansas in the spring. The well needs checking, she said. The level was lower than I expected this week. Check it. I can check it. I know you can, he said. Check it anyway. She looked at him sideways. Division of labor, she said. I like checking the well, he said. Wasn't entirely true, but it was mostly true, and she seemed to understand the distinction. They stood at the fence for a while longer. The cattle moved through the grass. I want to write to Pearl's husband, Lenora said. He looked at her. She was still watching the pasture. I haven't written to him since just after. 3 years. I kept telling myself there wasn't anything to say. She was quiet for a moment. I think I have something to say now. What? He asked. Not prying. Just asking. She thought about it. That the cradle is all right, she said. That it's in a home. That it's... She paused. I want him to know that what he sent me wasn't just something I carried around. It turned into something. Silas was quiet. Write to him, he said. She nodded. Do you know what I'd tell him? She said. If I was trying to explain it? What? She looked at the east pasture, at the sky above it, at the place where the land met the horizon in the long flat way of the plains. That I came out here looking for honest work, she said, and I found it. And that honest work, when you do it alongside the right people, turns into something you don't have a name for until you're already living inside it. He looked at the same horizon she was looking at. That'll do, he said. She looked at him. It'll do for the letter, he said. Not sure it covers all of it. She held his gaze. No, she said. It doesn't cover all of it. The moment sat between them in the April light, not needing to be resolved. That evening, after supper, Maisie brought the cedar cradle to the center of the main room, dragged it, actually, which required more effort than she expected, and she would not accept help, a characteristic that was becoming more pronounced by the week. What are you doing? Lenora asked, fixing it. Maisie said, There's nothing wrong with it. It's in the corner, Maisie said, with the air of someone identifying a problem that should have been obvious. It should be where people can see it. She positioned it to her satisfaction, then stepped back and examined it. Then she went and got Nell from her alcove and placed the doll in the cradle with ceremony. She stood back again. Better, she said. Silas looked at the cradle in the middle of the room. Then at Lenora. Lenora was looking at the cradle with an expression he had only seen on her face a few times, the unguarded one, the one she couldn't fully keep composed. But this time it was different from the first times he'd seen it. This time it wasn't the expression of someone looking at grief. It was the expression of someone looking at something that was both things at once, what was lost and what had been found, and understanding that those two things could share a space without one canceling the other. She looked at him. "She's not wrong," Lenora said. "It is better where people can see it." He nodded. He got up and moved his chair slightly so the cradle wasn't blocked from the firelight. Maisie noticed this and approved without saying so, which was its own kind of approval. She climbed into Lenora's lap, not asking, just doing it, which was fully within her operating procedure by now, and tucked herself in and was quiet for a while in the way she got when the day was winding down and she was somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. "Nora," she said, "When the baby comes, will Nell have to share the cradle?" The room went very still. Silas looked at Maisie. Lenora looked at Maisie. Maisie appeared to be in earnest. She was also more than half asleep. "There's no baby coming." "Sweetheart," Lenora said, carefully. Adelaide's mother said, "Probably soon," Maisie said, in the mumbling way of someone very close to sleep. She told Mrs. Cooper at the feed store. "I was under the table again." "You're always under tables," Silas said. "Tables are good," Maisie said with profound conviction. She was asleep about 4 minutes later, fully and completely, the way children are asleep when they've burned through the last of the day and have nothing left. Silas looked at Lenora over Maisie's head. Lenora looked at him. She had 2 spots of color on her cheeks that might have been the fire. "Martha heard," she said. "Martha heard," he agreed. "Talks extensively." There was a pause. "Is she wrong?" Silas said. Lenora looked at him. The 2 spots of color were definitely not just the fire. "I wasn't going to say anything yet," she said. I wanted to be certain before." "Lenora." She looked at him. "Is she wrong?" he asked again, quietly. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "No," Lenora said. The fire breathed. The cradle sat where Maisie had put it, in the center of the room where people could see it, with Nell tucked inside under a scrap of cloth. Most of its windows were dark. The April night was outside the windows, warmer than the months before it, with the smell of the turned earth of the vegetable garden coming through the gap under the back door. Silas looked at the cradle. He thought about the woman who had carried it from Nebraska to this house. The weight of it, not the wood, the other weight. The waste of its wind through his gate, with almost nothing, except that and the journal, and the particular quality of someone who needed somewhere real to start again. He thought about Pearl, who he had never met and never would, and the child Pearl had not lived to hold, and the cradle that had waited through 3 years of being carried like guilt before it found its way to a room where a 4-year-old put a corn husk doll in it and declared it better. He thought about Clara in her place, under the cottonwood in the east pasture, and how she had been a practical woman who would have had a great deal of opinions about the state of the food stores, and how he had been holding her memory so tight for 2 years that he'd forgotten it could be held differently. Not less. Just differently, with room around it for what was still happening. He thought about Maisie sleeping in Lenora's lap with the total trust of a child who has found the place she belongs and knows it. He thought about the notice he'd written in a bad mood that sounded like a man selling furniture, but had somehow said the true thing. Despite itself, the child's name is Maisie. She is 4 years old. She is the reason I am writing this, and how the only person who had answered, like she understood, that had carried a cedar cradle from Nebraska and arrived at his gate in a gray dress with a travel bag and the quiet of someone who was done with performing things for other people. He got up. He went to the porch and stood in the April night for a while, looking at the south field and the night sky with its unreasonable number of stars. After a minute, he heard the door open behind him, and Lenora came and stood beside him. "She's still asleep," Lenora said. "Good." They stood on the porch in the dark. "I'm scared," Lenora said. And the fact that she said it out loud to him, with the direct simplicity she brought to difficult truths, told him more about what had grown between them than anything that had come before. Because she had not been someone who said what scared her when she arrived. She had been someone who held it, carried it, like the cradle. "I know," he said, "after Pearl, She stopped. "I know what can go wrong." "I know," he said again. She was quiet. "It doesn't stop it from going right," he said. She looked at him. "That's not a very reassuring thing to say," she said. "No," he said. "But it's the true one, and you don't want anything other than the true one." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "I don't." He reached out and found her hand in the dark. She didn't pull away. They stood on the porch of Raven Creek Homestead in the April night, with the stars over the Kansas plain and the fields that were theirs, and the house that was warm behind them, and the cradle inside that had been waiting, through more loss than any single object should be asked to carry, for exactly this. He had sent away for a bride who never came. She had come west looking for honest work. Neither of them had been looking for this. But that was the thing about the life you didn't plan for. It tended to be more durable than the one you did. Built from what was actually true about you, rather than what you imagined you needed. Built from inventory and account books, and a child who listened under tables and a cedar cradle that turned out to have more life in it yet. Not perfect. Not even close. He was still a man who went still instead of saying things. She was still a woman who held too long and came back in her own time. Maisie was still a person with extremely strong opinions about dolls and the superior location of tables, and that wasn't changing. But the house held. The land was theirs. And in the spring that was coming across the Kansas plain, all the stubborn momentum of things that refused to be canceled by hard winters, Raven Creek was growing not just the crops in the fields and the vegetables in Lenora's expanded garden and the cattle on the east pasture, but the household itself, putting out something new, something that would need the cedar cradle that Maisie had moved to the center of the room so everyone could see it. Something that Pearl not have begrudged it. Something that Clara would have been practical and unsentimental about and secretly delighted by. Something that had not been planned by anyone and was, for exactly that reason, entirely real. Silas held Lenora's hand on the porch in the dark. The April wind came across the plain from the south, warmer than any wind since October, carrying with it the smell of the season that was coming. He breathed it in. He had asked her once, on the wagon ride home, from a hearing that had given them back what was theirs, what he would have said to her at the beginning if he'd known any of this was coming. He hadn't asked it out loud. He'd thought it. But standing here now, he thought he knew the answer. He would have said, I don't have much to offer, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I have a piece of Kansas plain and a stone chimney and a 4-year-old daughter who remembers everything and a habit of going silent when I should speak. I am not an easy life. And she would have said, I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real. And he would have said, then you came to the right place. He didn't say any of it now. He didn't need to. She already knew. They stood on the porch until the cold came back to remind them it was still April, only barely spring, still the frontier, and then they went inside to the warm kitchen and the sleeping child in the cradle in the center of the room, and they closed the door behind them, and the night outside was left to its own business, and Raven Creek was quiet and whole and home.